Where are we? Safe. But where? Chichester Harbour. He waved his arm seaward as though it was a goal. Do you think they will follow us? We have turned and turned again. It seemed to Hoopdriver that he heard her sob. She stood dimly there, holding her machine, and he, holding his, could go no nearer to her to see if she sobbed for weeping or for want of breath. What are we to do now? Her voice asked. Are you tired? He asked. I will do what has to be done. The two black figures in the broken light were silent for a space. Do you know, she said, I'm not afraid of you. I'm sure you are honest to me, and I do not even know your name. He was taken with a sudden shame of his homely patronymic. It's an ugly name, he said, but you are right in trusting me. I would do anything for you. This is nothing. She caught at her breath. She did not care to ask why, but compared with Bechamel. We take each other on trust, she said. Do you want to know how things are with me? That man, she went on, after the assent of his listening silence, promised to help and protect me. I was unhappy at home, never mind why. A stepmother, idle, unoccupied, hindered, cramped, that is enough perhaps. Then he came into my life, and talked to me of art and literature, and set my brain on fire. I wanted to come out into the world, to be a human being, not a thing in a hutch. And he, I know, said Hoopdriver. And now here I am. I will do anything, said Hoopdriver. She thought. You cannot imagine my stepmother. No, I could not describe her. I am entirely at your service. I will help you with all my power. I have lost an illusion and found a knight-errant. She spoke of Bechamel as the illusion. Mr. Hoopdriver felt flattered, but he had no adequate answer. I'm thinking, he said, full of rapture and protective responsibility, what we had best be doing. You are tired, you know, and we can't wander all night after the day we've had. That was Chichester we were near, she asked. If, he meditated with a tremble in his voice, you would make me your brother, Miss Beaumont? Yes. We could stop there together. She took a minute to answer. I am going to light these lamps, said Hoopdriver. He bent down to his own and struck a match on his shoe. She looked at his face in its light, grave and intent. How could she ever have thought him common or absurd? But you must tell me your name, brother, she said. Carrington, said Mr. Hoopdriver after a momentary pause. Who would be Hoopdriver on a night like this? But the Christian name? Christian name? My Christian name? Well, Chris. He snapped his lamp and stood up. If you will hold my machine, I will light yours, he said. She came round obediently and took his machine, and for a moment they stood face to face. My name, Brother Chris, she said, is Jessie. He looked into her eyes, and his excitement seemed arrested. Jessie, he repeated slowly. The mute emotion of his face affected her strangely. She had to speak. It's not such a very wonderful name, is it? She said with a laugh, to break the intensity. He opened his mouth and shut it again, and, with a sudden wincing of his features, abruptly turned and bent down to open the lantern in front of her machine. She looked down at him, almost kneeling in front of her, with an unreasonable approbation in her eyes. It was, as I have indicated, the hour and season of the full moon. Chapter 25. Mr. Hoopdriver conducted the rest of that night's journey with the same confident dignity as before, and it was chiefly by good luck and the fact that most roads about a town converge thereupon that Chichester was at last attained. It seemed at first as though everyone had gone to bed, but the red hotel still glowed yellow and warm. It was the first time Hoopdriver had dared the mysteries of a first-class hotel. But that night he was in the mood to dare anything. "So you found your young lady at last," said the ostler of the Red Hotel, for it chanced he was one of those of whom Hoopdriver had made inquiries in the afternoon. "Quite a misunderstanding," said Hoopdriver with splendid readiness. "My sister had gone to Bognor, but I brought her back here. I've took a fancy to this place, and the moonlight's simply divine." "We've had supper, thanks, and we're tired," said Mr. Hoopdriver. "I suppose you won't take anything, Jessie?" The glory of having her even as a sister, and to call her Jessie like that! But he carried it off splendidly, as he felt himself bound to admit. "Good night, sis," he said, "and pleasant dreams. I'll just have a look at this paper before I turn in." But this was living indeed, he told himself. So gallantly did Mr. Hoopdriver comport himself up to the very edge of the most wonderful day of all. It had begun early, you will remember, with a vigil in the little sweetstuff shop next door to the Angel at Midhurst. But to think of all the things that had happened since then. He caught himself in the middle of a yawn, pulled out his watch, saw the time was 11:30, and marched off, with a fine sense of heroism, bedward. Chapter 26. The Surbiton Interlude. And here, thanks to the glorious institution of sleep, comes a break in the narrative again. The absurd young people are safely tucked away now, their heads full of glowing nonsense indeed, but the course of their events at any rate is safe from any fresh developments through their activities for the next 8 hours or more. They are both sleeping healthily, you will perhaps be astonished to hear. Here is the girl. What girls are coming to nowadays, only Mrs. Lynn Linton can tell. In company with an absolute stranger, of low extraction and uncertain accent, unchaperoned and unabashed. Indeed, now she fancies she is safe, she is, if anything, a little proud of her own share in these transactions. Then this Mr. Hoopdriver of yours, roseate idiot that he is in illegal possession of a stolen bicycle, a stolen young lady, and 2 stolen names, established with them in a hotel that is quite beyond his means, and immensely proud of himself in a somnolent way for these incomparable follies. There are occasions when a moralizing novelist can merely wring his hands and leave matters to take their course. For all Hoopdriver knows or cares, he may be locked up the very first thing tomorrow morning for the rape of the cycle. Then in Bognor, let alone that melancholy vestige, Betchamal, with whom our dealings are, thank goodness, over, there is a coffee tavern with a steak Mr. Hoopdriver ordered, done to a cinder long ago, his American cloth parcel in a bedroom, and his own proper bicycle, by way of guarantee, carefully locked up in the hayloft. Tomorrow he will be a mystery, and they will be looking for his body along the seafront. And so far we have never given a glance at the desolate home in Surbiton. Familiar to you, no doubt, through the medium of illustrated interviews, where the unhappy stepmother— That stepmother, it must be explained, is quite well known to you. That is a little surprise I have prepared for you. She is Thomas Plantagenet, the gifted authoress of that witty and daring book, A Soul Untrammelled, and quite an excellent woman in her way, only it is such a crooked way. Her real name is Milton. She is a widow, and a charming one, only 10 years older than Jessie, and she is always careful to dedicate her more daring works to the sacred memory of my husband, to show that there's nothing personal, you know, in the matter. Considering her literary reputation, she was always speaking of herself as one I martyred for truth, because the critics advertised her written in decorums in column-long slates. Considering her literary reputation, I say, she was one of the most respectable women it is possible to imagine. She furnished correctly, dressed correctly, had severe notions of whom she might meet, went to church, and even at times took the sacrament in some esoteric spirit. And Jessie she brought up so carefully that she never even let her read A Soul Untrammelled, which, therefore, naturally enough, Jessie did, and went on from that to a feast of advanced literature. Mrs. Milton not only brought up Jessie carefully, but very slowly, so that at 17 she was still a clever schoolgirl, as you have seen her, and quite in the background of the little literary circle of unimportant celebrities which Thomas Plantagenet adorned. Mrs. Milton knew Betchamel's reputation of being a dangerous man, but then bad men are not bad women, and she let him come to her house to show she was not afraid. She took no account of Jessie. When the elopement came, therefore, it was a double disappointment to her, for she perceived his hand by a kind of instinct. She did the correct thing. The correct thing, as you know, is to take hansom cabs, regardless of expense, and weep and say you do not know what to do round the circle of your confidential friends. She could not have ridden nor wept more had Jessie been her own daughter. She showed the properest spirit, and she not only showed it, but felt it. Mrs. Milton, as a successful little authoress and still more successful widow of 32, Thomas Plantagenet is a charming woman, her reviewers used to write invariably, even if they spoke ill of her, found the steady growth of Jessie into womanhood an unmitigated nuisance, and had been willing enough to keep her in the background. And Jessie, who had started this intercourse at 14 with abstract objections to stepmothers, had been active enough in resenting this. Increasing rivalry and antagonism had sprung up between them, until they could engender quite a vivid hatred from a dropped hairpin or the cutting of a book with a sharpened knife. There is very little deliberate wickedness in the world. The stupidity of our selfishness gives much the same results indeed, but in the ethical laboratory it shows a different nature. And when the disaster came, Mrs. Milton's remorse for their gradual loss of sympathy and her share in the losing of it was genuine enough. You may imagine the comfort she got from her friends, and how West Kensington and Notting Hill and Hampstead, the literary suburbs, those decent penitentiaries of a once-core bohemian calling, hummed with the business. Her men, as a charming literary woman she had, of course, an organised corps, were immensely excited and were sympathetic, helpfully energetic, suggestive, alert, as their ideals of their various dispositions required them to be. "Any news of Jessie?" was the pathetic opening of a dozen melancholy but interesting conversations. To her men, she was not perhaps so damp as she was to her women friends, but in a quiet way she was even more touching. For 3 days, Wednesday that is, Thursday and Friday, nothing was heard of the fugitives. It was known that Jessie, wearing a patent costume with button-up skirts, and mounted on a diamond frame, safety with Dunlops, and a loofah-covered saddle, had ridden forth early in the morning, taking with her about £2 7s in money, and a grey touring case, packed, and there save for a brief note to her stepmother, a declaration of independence, it was said, an assertion of her ego containing extensive and very annoying quotations from A Soul Untrammelled, and giving no definite intimation of her plans, knowledge ceased. That note was shown to few, and then only in the strictest confidence. But on Friday evening late came a breathless man-friend, Widgery, a correspondent of hers, who had heard of her trouble among the first. He had been touring in Sussex, his knapsack was still on his back, and he testified hurriedly that at a place called Midhurst, in the bar of the hotel called the Angel, he had heard from a barmaid a vivid account of a young lady in grey. Descriptions tallied. But who was the man in brown? The poor misguided girl, I must go to her at once, she said, choking and rising with her hand to her heart. It is impossible tonight. There are no more trains. I looked on my way. A mother's love, she said. I bear her that. I know you do, he spoke with feeling, for no one admired his photographs of scenery more than Mrs. Milton. It's more than she deserves. Oh, don't speak unkindly of her. She has been misled. It was really very friendly of him. He declared he was only sorry his news ended there. Should he follow them and bring her back? He had come to her because he knew of her anxiety. It is good of you, she said, and quite instinctively took and pressed his hand. And to think of that poor girl tonight, it's dreadful. She looked into the fire that she had lit when he came in. The warm light fell upon her dark purple dress, and left her features in a warm shadow. She looked such a slight, frail thing to be troubled so. We must follow her. Her resolution seemed magnificent. I have no one to go with me. He must marry her, said the man. She has no friends. We have no one. After all, 2 women, so helpless. And this fair-haired little figure was the woman that people who knew her from only her books called bold, prurient even, simply because she was great-hearted, intellectual. He was overcome by the unspeakable pathos of her position. Mrs. Milton, he said, Hetty. She glanced at him. The overflow was imminent. Not now, she said. Not now. I must find her first. Yes, he said with intense emotion. He was one of those big fat men who feel deeply. But let me help you. At least let me help you. But can you spare time? She said. For me? For you? But what can I do? What can we do? Go to Midhurst, follow her on, trace her. She was there on Thursday night, last night. She cycled out of the town. Courage, he said. We will save her yet. She put out her hand and pressed his again. Courage, he repeated, finding it well received. There were alarms and excursions without. She turned her back to the fire, and he sat down suddenly in the big armchair, which suited his dimensions admirably. Then the door opened, and the girl showed in Dangle, who looked curiously from one to the other. There was emotion here. He had heard the armchair creaking, and Mrs. Milton, whose face was flushed, displayed a suspicious alacrity to explain. You too, she said, are one of my good friends, and we have news of her at last. It was decidedly an advantage to Widgery, but Dangle determined to show himself a man of resource. In the end, he too was accepted for the Midhurst expedition, to the intense disgust of Widgery. And young Phipps, a callow youth of few words, faultless collars, and fervent devotion, was also enrolled before the evening was out. They would scour the country, all 3 of them. She appeared to brighten up a little, but it was evident she was profoundly touched. She did not know what she had done to merit such friends. Her voice broke a little. She moved towards the door, and young Phipps, who was a youth of action rather than words, sprang and opened it, proud to be first. She is sorely troubled, said Dangle to Widgery. We must do what we can for her. She is a wonderful woman, said Dangle, so subtle, so intricate, so many-faceted. She feels this deeply. Young Phipps said nothing, but he felt the more, and yet they say the age of chivalry is dead. But this is the only interlude, introduced to give our wanderers time to refresh themselves by good, honest sleeping. For the present, therefore, we will not concern ourselves with the starting of the rescue party, nor with Mrs. Milton's simple but becoming grey dress, with the healthy Widgery's Norfolk jacket and thick boots, with the slender Dangle's energetic bearing, nor with the wonderful checkerings that set off the legs of the golf-suited Phipps. They are after us. In a little while they will be upon us. You must imagine, as best you can, the competitive raidings at Midhurst of Widgery, Dangle, and Phipps. How Widgery was great at questions, and Dangle good at inference, and Phipps so conspicuously inferior in everything that he felt it, and sulked with Mrs. Milton most of the day, after the manner of your callow youth the whole world over. Mrs. Milton stopped at the Angel and was very sad and charming and intelligent, and Widgery paid the bill in the afternoon of Saturday Chichester was attained. But by that time our fugitives, as you shall immediately hear. Chapter 27. The Awakening of Mr. Hoopdriver. Mr. Hoopdriver stirred on his pillow, opened his eyes, and, staring unmeaningly, yawned. The bedclothes were soft and pleasant. He turned the peaked nose that overrides the insufficient moustache up to the ceiling, a pinkish projection over the billow of white. You might see it wrinkle as he yawned again, and then became quiet. So matters remained for a space. Very slowly recollection returned to him. Then a shock of indeterminate brown hair appeared, and first one watery grey eye a-wandering, and then two. The bed upheaved, and you had him, his thin neck projecting abruptly from the clothes he held about him, his face staring about the room. He held the clothes about him, I hope I may explain, because his nightshirt was at Bognor in an American cloth packet, derelict. He yawned a third time, rubbed his eyes, smacked his lips. He was recalling almost everything now. The pursuit, the hotel, the tremulous daring of his entry, the swift adventure of the inn-yard, the moonlight. Abruptly he threw the clothes back and rose into a sitting position on the edge of the bed. Without was the noise of shutters being unfastened and doors unlocked, and the passing of hoofs and wheels in the street. He looked at his watch. 6:30. He surveyed the sumptuous room again. "Lord," said Mr. Hoopdriver, "it wasn't a dream after all." "I wonder what they charge for these juiced rooms," said Mr. Hoopdriver, nursing one rosy foot. He became meditative, tugging at his insufficient moustache. Suddenly he gave vent to a noiseless laugh. What a rush it was! Rushed in and off with this girl right under his nose. Planned it well too. Talk of highway robbery. Talk of brigands up and off. How juiced, sold he must be feeling. It was a shave too, in the coachyard. Suddenly he became silent. Abruptly his eyebrows rose and his jaw fell. "I say," said Mr. Hoopdriver. He had never thought of it before. Perhaps you will understand the whirl he had been in overnight, but one sees things clearer in the daylight. "I'm hanged if I haven't been and stolen a blessed bicycle." "Who cares?" said Mr. Hoopdriver presently, and his face supplied the answer. Then he thought of the young lady in grey again, and tried to put a more heroic complexion on the business. But of an early morning, on an empty stomach, as with characteristic coarseness medical men put it, Heroics are of a more difficult growth than by moonlight. Everything had seemed exceptionally fine and brilliant, but quite natural the evening before. Mr. Hoopdriver reached out his hand, took his Norfolk jacket, laid it over his knees, and took out the money from the little ticket pocket. 14 6/2, he said, holding the coins in his left hand and stroking his chin with his right. He verified, by patting, the presence of a pocket-book in the breast pocket. 5 14 6/2, said Mr. Hoopdriver, left. With the Norfolk jacket still on his knees, he plunged into another silent meditation. That wouldn't matter, he said. It's the bike's the bother. No good going back to Bognor. Might send it back by carrier, of course, thanking him for the loan, having no further use. Mr. Hoopdriver chuckled and lapsed into the silent concoction of a delightfully impudent letter. Mr. J. Hoopdriver presents his compliments. But the grave note reasserted itself. Might trundle back there in an hour, of course, and exchange them. My old croc's so blessed shabby. He's sure to be spiteful too. Have me run in, perhaps. Then she'd be in just the same old fix, only worse. You see, I'm her knight-errant. It complicates things so. His eye, wandering loosely, rested on the sponge bath. What the deuce do they want with cream pans in a bedroom? Said Mr. Hoopdriver en passant. Best thing we can do is set out of here as soon as possible anyhow. I suppose she'll go home to her friends. That bicycle is a juicy nuisance anyhow. Juicy nuisance. He jumped to his feet with a sudden awakening of energy to proceed with his toilet. Then, with a certain horror, he remembered that the simple necessaries of that process were at Bognor. Lord, he remarked, and whistled silently for a space. Rummy go, profit and loss. Profit, one sister with bicycle complete. What offers? Cheap for tooth and hairbrush, vests, nightshirt, stockings and sundries. Make the best of it. And presently, when it came to hairbrushing, he had to smooth his troubled locks with his hand. It was a poor result. Sneak out and get a shave, I suppose, and buy a brush and so on. Think again, beard don't show much. He ran his hand over his chin, looked at himself steadfastly for some time, and curled his insufficient moustache up with some care. Then he fell a-meditating on his beauty. He considered himself 3/4 face, left and right. An expression of distaste crept over his features. Looking won't alter it, Hoopdriver, he remarked. You're a weedy customer, my man, shoulders narrow, skimpy anyhow. He put his knuckles on the toilet table and regarded himself with his chin lifted in the air. Good Lord, he said. What a neck! Wonder why I got such a thundering lump there. He sat down on the bed, his eye still on the glass. If I'd been exercised properly, if I'd been fed reasonable, if I hadn't been shoved out of a silly school into a silly shop. But there, the old folks didn't know no better. The schoolmaster ought to have. But he didn't, poor old fool. Still, when it comes to meeting a girl like this, it's hard. I wonder what Adam'd think of me as a specimen. Civilization, eh? Heir of the ages. I'm nothing. I know nothing. I can't do anything. Sketch a bit. Why wasn't I made an artist? Beastly cheap, after all, this suit does look, in the sunshine. No good, Hoopdriver. Anyhow, you don't tell yourself any lies about it. Lovers ain't your game, anyway. But there's other things yet. You can help the young lady, and you will, I suppose she'll be going home, and that business of the bicycles to see to, too, my man. Forward, Hoopdriver. If you ain't a beauty, that's no reason why you should stop and be copped, is it? And having got back in his way to a gloomy kind of self-satisfaction, He had another attempt at his hair preparatory to leaving his room and hurrying on breakfast for an early departure. While breakfast was preparing, he wandered out into South Street and refurnished himself with the elements of luggage again. "No expense to be spared," he murmured, disgorging the half-sovereign. Chapter 28. The Departure from Chichester. He caused his sister to be called repeatedly, and when she came down, explained with a humorous smile his legal relationship to the bicycle in the yard. Might be disagreeable, you know. His anxiety was obvious enough. "Very well," she said, quite friendly. "Hurry breakfast and we'll ride out. I want to talk things over with you." The girl seemed more beautiful than ever after the night's sleep. Her hair in comely dark waves from her forehead, her ungauntleted fingertips pink and cool. And how decided she was. Breakfast was a nervy ceremony, conversation fraternal but thin. The waiter overawed him, and he was cowed by a multiplicity of forks. But she called him Chris. They discussed their route over his sixpenny county map for the sake of talking, but avoided a decision in the presence of the attendant. The £5 note was changed for the bill, and through Hoopdriver's determination to be quite the gentleman, the waiter and chambermaid got £0.50 each, and the ostler a florin. "Holidays," said the ostler to himself without gratitude. The public mountain of the bicycles in the street was a moment of trepidation. A policeman actually stopped and watched them from the opposite curb. Suppose him to come across and ask, "Is that your bicycle, sir?" Fight or drop it and run. It was a time of bewildering apprehension, too, going through the streets of the town, so that a milk cart barely escaped destruction under Mr. Hoopdriver's chancy wheel. That recalled him to a sense of erratic steering, and he pulled himself together. In the lanes he breathed freer, and a less formal conversation presently began. "You've ridden out of Chichester in a great hurry," said Jessie. "Well, the fact of it is, I'm worried, just a little bit, about this machine." "Of course," she said, "I had forgotten that. But where are we going?" "Just a turning or two more, if you don't mind," said Hoopdriver. "Just a mile or so. I have to think of you, you know. I should feel more easy if we was locked up, you know. Not that I should mind on my own account." They rode with a streaky grey sea coming and going on their left hand. Every mile they put between themselves and Chichester, Mr. Hoopdriver felt a little less conscience-stricken and a little more of the gallant desperado. Here he was, riding on a splendid machine, with a slap-up girl beside him. What would they think of it in the Emporium if any of them were to see him? He imagined in detail the astonishment of Miss Isaacs and of Miss Howe. "Why, it's Mr. Hoopdriver," Miss Isaacs would say. "Never," emphatically from Miss Howe. Then he played with Briggs, and then tried the GV in a shay. Fancy introducing him to her, my sister pro tem. He was her brother Chris. Chris what? Confound it! Harrington. Something like that. He'll have to keep off that topic until he could remember. Wished he told her the truth now. Almost. He glanced at her. She was riding with her eyes straight ahead of her, thinking. A little perplexed, perhaps, she seemed. He noticed how well she rode, and that she rode with her lips closed, a thing he could never manage. Mr. Hoopdriver's mind came round to the future. What was she going to do? What were they both going to do? His thoughts took a graver colour. He had rescued her. This was fine, manly rescue work he was engaged upon. She ought to go home, in spite of that stepmother. He must insist gravely, but firmly upon that. She was the spirited sort, of course, but still. Wonder if she had any money. Wonder what the second-class fare from Havant to London is. Of course, he would have to pay that. It was the regular thing, he being a gentleman. Then, should he take her home? He began to rough in a moving sketch of the return. The stepmother repentant of her indescribable cruelties would be present. Even these rich people have their troubles. Probably an uncle or two. The footman would announce, Mr. bother that name, and Miss Milton. Then 2 women, weeping together, and a knightly figure in the background, dressed in a handsome Norfolk jacket, still conspicuously new. He would conceal his feelings until the very end. Then, leaving, he would pause in the doorway in such an attitude as Mr. George Alexander might assume, and say, slowly and dwindlingly, Be kind to her, be kind to her, and so depart, heartbroken to the meanest intelligence. But that was a matter for the future. He would have to begin discussing the return soon. There was no traffic along the road, and he came up beside her. He had fallen behind in his musing. She began to talk. Mr. Dennison, she began, and then doubtfully, That is your name. I am very stupid. It is, said Mr. Hoopdriver. Dennison, was it? Dennison, Dennison, Dennison? What was she saying? I wonder how far you are willing to help me. Confoundedly hard to answer a question like that on the spur of the moment, without steering wildly. You may rely, said Mr. Hoopdriver, recovering from a violent wobble. I can assure you I want to help you very much. Don't consider me at all. Leastways, consider me entirely at your service. It was a nuisance not being able to say this kind of thing right. You see, I am so awkwardly situated. If I can only help you, you will make me very happy. There was a pause. Round a bend in the road, they came upon a grassy space between hedge and road, set with yarrow and meadowsweet, where a felled tree lay among the green. There she dismounted, and, propping her machine against a stone, sat down. Here we can talk, she said. Yes, said Mr. Hoopdriver, expectant. She answered after a little while, sitting elbow on knee, with her chin in her hand, and looking straight in front of her. I don't know. I am resolved to live my own life. Of course, said Mr. Hoopdriver, naturally. I want to live, and I want to see what life means. I want to learn. Everyone is hurrying me. Everything is hurrying me. I want time to think. Mr. Hoopdriver was puzzled, but admiring. It was wonderful how clear and ready her words were. But then one might speak well with a throat and lips like that. He knew he was inadequate, but he tried to meet the occasion. If you let them rush you into anything, you might repent of course, you'd be very silly. Don't you want to learn? She asked. I was wandering only this morning, he began, and stopped. She was too intent upon her own thoughts to notice this insufficiency. I find myself in life, and it terrifies me. I seem to be like a little speck, whirling on a wheel, suddenly caught up. What am I here for? I ask. Simply to be here at a time. I asked it a week ago. I asked it yesterday, and I ask it today. And little things happen, and the days pass. My stepmother takes me shopping. People come to tea. There is a new play to pass the time, or a concert, or a novel. The wheels of the world go on turning, turning. It is horrible. I want to do a miracle like Joshua and stop the whirl until I have found it out. At home, it's impossible. Mr. Hoopdriver stroked his moustache. It is so, he said in a meditative tone. Things will go on, he said. The faint breath of summer stirred the trees, and a bunch of dandelion puff lifted among the meadowsweet and struck and broke into a dozen separate threads against his knee. They flew on apart and sank as the breeze fell among the grass, some to germinate, some to perish. His eye followed them until they had vanished. I can't go back to Surbiton, said the young lady in grey. Eh? Said Mr. Hoopdriver, catching at his moustache. This was an unexpected development. I want to write, you see, said the young lady in grey, to write books and alter things, to do good. I want to lead a free life and own myself. I can't go back. I want to obtain a position as a journalist. I have been told, but I know no one to help me at once, no one that I could go to. There is one person. She was a mistress at my school. If I could write to her, but then, how could I get her answer? Said Mr. Hoopdriver, very grave. I can't trouble you much more. You have come, you have risked things. That don't count, said Mr. Hoopdriver. It's double pay to let me do it, so to speak. It is good of you to say that. Surbiton is so conventional. I am resolved to be unconventional at any cost. But we are so hampered. If I could only burgeon out of all that hinders me. I want to struggle, to take my place in the world. I want to be my own mistress, to shape my own career, but my stepmother objects so. She does as she likes herself, and is strict with me to ease her conscience. And if I go back now, go back owning myself beaten, she left the rest to his imagination. I see that, agreed Mr. Hoopdriver. He must help her. Within his skull he was doing some intricate arithmetic with £5, 6 and 2p. In some vague way he inferred from all this that Jessie was trying to escape from an undesirable marriage, but was saying these things out of modesty. His circle of ideas was so limited. You know, Mr. I've forgotten your name again. Mr. Hoopdriver seemed lost in abstraction. You can't go back, of course, quite like that, he said thoughtfully. His ears waxed suddenly red, and his cheeks flushed. But what is your name? Name? Said Mr. Hoopdriver. Why, Benson, of course. Mr. Benson, yes, it's really very stupid of me, but I can never remember names. I must make a note on my cuff. She clicked a little silver pencil and wrote the name down. If I could write to my friend, I believe she would be able to help me to an independent life. I could write to her or telegraph. Write, I think. I could scarcely explain in a telegram. I know she would help me. Clearly there was only one course open to a gentleman under the circumstances. In that case, said Mr. Hoopdriver, if you don't mind trusting yourself to a stranger, we might continue as we are perhaps, for a day or so, until you heard. Suppose 30 shillings a day, that gives 4 days. Say 4 30s is 126 quid. Well, 3 days, say 410. You are very good to me. His expression was eloquent. Very well then, and thank you. It's wonderful. It's more than I deserve that you... She dropped the theme abruptly. What was our bill at Chichester? Eh? Said Mr. Hoopdriver, feigning a certain stupidity. There was a brief discussion. Secretly he was delighted at her insistence in paying. She carried her point. Their talk came round to their immediate plans for the day. They decided to ride easily through Havant and stop perhaps at Fareham or Southampton, for the previous day had tried them both. Holding the map extended on his knee, Mr. Hoopdriver's eye fell by chance on the bicycle at his feet. That bicycle, he remarked, quite irrelevantly, wouldn't look the same machine if I got a big double elerum instead of that little bell. Why? Just a thought. A pause. Very well then. Havant and lunch, said Jessie, rising. I wish, somehow, we could have managed it without stealing that machine, said Hoopdriver, because it is stealing it, you know, come to think of it. Nonsense. If Mr. Betchamel troubles you, I will tell the whole world, if need be. "I believe you would," said Mr. Hoopdriver, admiring her. "You're plucky enough, goodness knows." Discovering suddenly that she was standing, he too rose and picked up her machine. She took it and wheeled it into the road. Then he took his own. He paused, regarding it. "I say," said he, "how'd this bike look now if it was enamelled grey?" She looked over her shoulder at his grave face. "Why try and hide it in that way?" "It was just a passing thought," said Mr. Hoopdriver airily. "Didn't mean anything, you know." As they were riding on to Havant, it occurred to Mr. Hoopdriver in a transitory manner that the interview had been quite other than his expectation. But that was the way with everything in Mr. Hoopdriver's experience. And though his wisdom looked grave within him, and caution was chinking coins, and an ancient prejudice in favour of property shook her head, something else was there too, shouting in his mind to drown all these saner considerations. The intoxicating thought of riding beside her all today, all tomorrow, perhaps for other days after that, of talking to her familiarly, being brother of all her slender strength and freshness, of having a golden, real and wonderful time beyond all his imaginings. His old familiar fancyings gave place to anticipations of impalpable and fluctuating and beautiful as the sunset of a summer day. At Havant he took an opportunity to purchase, at a small hairdresser's in the main street, a toothbrush, a pair of nail scissors, and a little bottle of stuff to darken the moustache, an article the shopman introduced to his attention, recommended highly, and sold in the excitement of the occasion. Chapter 29. The Unexpected Anecdote of the Lion. They rode on to Cosham and lunched lightly but expensively there. Jessie went out and posted her letter to her school friend. Then the green height of Portsdown Hill tempted them, and leaving their machines in the village, they clambered up the slope to the silent red brick fort that crowned it. Thence they had a view of Portsmouth and its cluster of sister towns, and crowded narrows of the harbour, the Solent and the Isle of Wight, like a blue cloud through the hot haze. Jessie, by some miracle, had become a skirted woman in the Cosham Inn. Mr. Hoopdriver lounged gracefully on the turf, smoked a red herring cigarette, and lazily regarded the fortified towns that spread like a map away there, the inner line of defence, like toy fortifications a mile off perhaps, and beyond that a few little fields, and then the beginnings of Landport suburb, and the smoky cluster of the multitudinous houses. To the right, at the head of the harbour shallows, the town of Portchester rose among the trees. Mr. Hoopdriver's anxiety receded to some remote corner of his brain, and that florid half-voluntary imagination of his shared the stage with the image of Jessie. He began to speculate on the impression he was creating. He took stock of his suit in a more optimistic spirit and reviewed, with some complacency, his actions for the last 24 hours. Then he was dashed at the thought of her infinite perfections. She had been observing him quietly, rather more closely during the last hour or so. She did not look at him directly, because he seemed always looking at her. Her own troubles had quieted down a little, and her curiosity about the chivalrous, worshipping, but singular gentleman in brown was awakening. She had recalled, too, the curious incident of their first encounter. She found him hard to explain to herself. You must understand that her knowledge of the world was rather less than nothing, having been obtained entirely from books. You must not take a certain ignorance for foolishness. She had begun with a few experiments. He did not know French except s'il vous plaît, a phrase he seemed to regard as a very good light table joke in itself. His English was uncertain, but not such as books informed her distinguished the lower classes. His manners seemed to her good on the whole, but a trifle over-respectful and out of fashion. He called her Madame once. He seemed a person of means and leisure, but he knew nothing of recent concerts, theatres, or books. How did he spend his time? He was certainly chivalrous, and a trifle simple-minded. She fancied, so much is there in a change of costume, that she had never met with such a man before. What could he be? "Mr. Benson," she said, breaking a silence devoted to landscape. He rolled over and regarded her, chin on knuckles. "At your service. Do you paint? Are you an artist?" "Well," judicious pause. "I should hardly call myself an artist, you know. I do paint a little, and sketch, you know, skitty kind of things." He plucked and began to nibble a blade of grass. It was really not much lying as his quick imagination that prompted him to add, "In papers, you know, and all that." "I see," said Jessie, looking at him thoughtfully. Artists were a very heterogeneous class certainly, and geniuses had a trick of being a little odd. He avoided her eye and bit his grass. "I don't do much, you know." "It's not your profession?" "Oh, no," said Hoopdriver, anxious now to hedge. "I don't make a regular thing of it, you know. Just now and then something comes into my head, and down it goes. No, I'm not a regular artist." "Then you don't practice any regular profession?" Mr. Hoopdriver looked into her eyes and saw there quite unsuspicious regard. He had vague ideas of resuming the detective role. "It's like this," he said, to gain time. "I have a sort of profession, only there's a kind of reason, nothing much, you know. I beg your pardon for cross-examining you." "No trouble," said Mr. Hoopdriver, "only I can't very well leave it to you, you know. I don't want to make any mystery of it, so far as that goes." Should he plunge boldly and be a barrister? That anyhow was something pretty good. But she might know about barristry. "I think I could guess what you are." "Well, guess," said Mr. Hoopdriver. "You come from one of the colonies?" "Dear me," said Mr. Hoopdriver, veering round to the new wind. "How did you find out that?" The man was born in a London suburb, dear reader. "I guessed," she said. He lifted his eyebrows as one astonished, and clutched a new piece of grass. "You were educated up country." "Good again," said Hoopdriver, rolling over again into her elbow. "You're a clairvoyant." He bit at the grass, smiling. "Which colony was it?" "That I don't know." "You must guess," said Hoopdriver. "South Africa," she said. "I strongly incline to South Africa." "South Africa's quite a large place," he said. "But South Africa is right." "You're warm," said Hoopdriver, anyhow. And while his imagination was eagerly exploring this new province, "South Africa is right," she insisted. He turned over and nodded, smiling reassuringly into her eyes. "What made me think of South Africa was that novel of Oliver Schreiner's, you know, The Story of an African Farm. Gregory Rose is so like you." "I never read The Story of an African Farm," said Hoopdriver. "I must. What's he like?" "You must read the book, but it's a wonderful place, with its mixture of races and its brand new civilization jostling the old savagery. Were you near Karma?" "He was a long way off from our place," said Mr. Hoopdriver. "We had a little ostrich farm, you know, just a few hundred of them out Johannesburg way." "On the Karoo, was it called?" "That's the term. Some of it was freehold, though. Luckily, we got along very well in the old days, but there's no ostriches on the farm now." He had a diamond mine in his head just at that moment, but he stopped and left a little to the girl's imagination. Besides which, It had occurred to him with a kind of shock that he was lying. What became of the ostriches? We sold 'em off when we parted with the farm. Do you mind if I have another cigarette? That was when I was quite a little chap, you know, that we had this ostrich farm. Did you have blacks and Boers about you? Lots, said Mr. Hoopdriver, striking a match on his instep and beginning to feel hot at the new responsibility he had brought upon himself. How interesting! Do you know I've never been out of England except to Paris and Mentone and Switzerland. One gets tired of travelling, puff, after a bit of course. You must tell me about your farm in South Africa. It always stimulates my imagination to think of these places. I can fancy all the tall ostriches being driven out by a black herd to graze, I suppose. How do ostriches feed? Well, said Hoopdriver, that's rather various. They have their fancies, you know. There's fruit, of course, and that kind of thing. And chicken food, and so forth. You have to use judgment. Did you ever see a lion? They weren't very common in our district, said Hoopdriver quite modestly. But I've seen them, of course, once or twice. Fancy seeing a lion. Were you frightened? Mr. Hoopdriver was now thoroughly sorry he had accepted that offer of South Africa. He puffed his cigarette and regarded the Solent languidly as he settled the fate on that lion in his mind. I scarcely had time, he said. It all happened in a minute. Go on, she said. I was going across the inner paddock where the fatted ostriches were. Did you eat ostriches then? I did not know. Eat them? Often. Very nice they are too, properly stuffed. Well, I was going across this paddock, and I saw something standing up in the moonlight and looking at me. Mr. Hoopdriver was in a hot perspiration now. His invention seemed to have gone limp. Luckily, I had my father's gun with me. I was scared, though, I can tell you. Puff. I just aimed at the end I thought was the head, and let fly. Puff. And over it went, you know. Dead? As dead. It was one of the luckiest shots I ever fired, and I wasn't much over 9 at the time neither. I should have screamed and run away. There's some things you can't run away from, said Mr. Hoopdriver. To run would have been death. I don't think I ever met a lion killer before, she remarked, evidently with a heightened opinion of him. There was a pause. She seemed meditating further questions. Mr. Hoopdriver drew his watch hastily. I say, said Mr. Hoopdriver, showing it to her, don't you think we ought to be getting on? His face was flushed, his ears bright red. She ascribed his confusion to modesty. He rose with a lion added to the burthens of his conscience, and held out his hand to assist her. They walked down into Cosham again, resumed their machines, and went on at a leisurely pace along the northern shore of the big harbour. But Mr. Hoopdriver was no longer happy. This horrible, this fulsome lie stuck in his memory. Why had he done it? She did not ask for any more South African stories, happily, at least until Porchester was reached, but talked instead of living one's own life, and how custom hung on people like chains. She talked wonderfully, and set Hoopdriver's mind fermenting. By the castle, Mr. Hoopdriver caught several crabs in little shore pools. At Fareham, they stopped for a second tea, and left the place towards the hour of sunset, under such invigorating circumstances as you shall in due course hear. Chapter 30. The Rescue Expedition. And now to tell of those energetic chevaliers, Widgery, Dangle, and Phipps, and of that distressed beauty, Thomas Plantagenet, well known in society, so the photographs said, as Mrs. Milton. We left them at Midhurst Station, if I remember rightly, waiting, in a state of fine emotion, for the Chichester train. It was clearly understood by the entire rescue party that Mrs. Milton was bearing up bravely against almost overwhelming grief. The three gentlemen outbid one another in sympathetic expedients. They watched her gravely, almost tenderly. The substantial Widgery tugged at his moustache and looked his unspeakable feelings at her with those dog-like brown eyes of his. The slender Dangle tugged at his moustache and did what he could with unsympathetic grey ones. Phipps, unhappily, had no moustache to run any risk with, so he folded his arms and talked in a brave, indifferent, bearing-up tone about London, Brighton, and South Coast Railway, just to cheer the poor woman up a little. And even Mrs. Milton really felt that exalted melancholy to the very bottom of her heart, and tried to show it in a dozen little, delicate feminine ways. "There is nothing to do until we get to Chichester," said Dangle. "Nothing." "Nothing," said Widgery, and aside in her ear, "You really ate scarcely anything, you know." "Their trains are always late," said Phipps, with his fingers along the edge of his collar. Dangle, you must understand, was a sub-editor and reviewer, and his pride was to be Thomas Plantagenet's intellectual companion. Widgery, the big man, was a manager of a bank and a mighty golfer, and his conception of his relations to her never came into his mind without those charming odd lines, Douglas, Douglas, tender and true, falling hard upon its heels. His name was Douglas Widgery, and Phipps was a medical student still, and he felt that he laid his heart at her feet, the heart of a man of the world. She was kind to them all in her way, and insisted on their being friends together, in spite of a disposition to reciprocal criticism they displayed. Dangle thought Widgery a Philistine, appreciating but coarsely the merits of a soul untrammelled, and Widgery thought Dangle lacked humanity, would talk insincerely to say a clever thing. Both Dangle and Widgery thought Phipps a bit of a cub, and Phipps thought both Dangle and Widgery a couple of thundering bounders. "They would have got to Chichester in time for lunch," said Dangle in the train. "After, perhaps, and there's no sufficient place in the road. So soon as we get there, Phipps must inquire at the chief hotels to see if anyone answering to her description has lunched there." "Oh, I'll inquire," said Phipps, "willingly. I suppose you and Widgery will just hang about?" He saw an expression of pain on Mrs. Milton's gentle face and stopped abruptly. "No," said Dangle, "we shan't hang about, as you put it. There are two places in Chichester where tourists might go, the cathedral and a remarkably fine museum. I shall go to the cathedral and make an inquiry or so, while Widgery—" "The museum, very well, and after that there's a little thing or two I've thought of myself," said Widgery. To begin with, they took Mrs. Milton in a kind of procession to the Red Hotel, and established her there with some tea. "You are so kind to me," she said, "all of you." They signified that it was nothing, and dispersed to their inquiries. By 6 they returned, their zeal a little damped, without news. Widgery came back with Dangle. Phipps was the last to return. "You're quite sure," said Widgery, "that there isn't any flaw in that reference of yours?" "Quite," said Dangle, rather shortly. "Of course," said Widgery, "their starting from Midhurst on the Chichester road doesn't absolutely bind them not to change their minds." "My dear fellow, it does. Really it does. You must allow me to have enough intelligence to think of crossroads. Really you must. There aren't any crossroads to tempt them. Would they turn aside here? No. Would they turn there? Many more things are inevitable than you fancy." "We shall see at once," said Widgery at the window. "Here comes Phipps. For my own part—" "Phipps," said Mrs. Milton. "Is he hurrying? Does he look—" She rose in her eagerness, biting her trembling lip, and went towards the window. "No news," said Phipps, entering. Ah, said Widgery. None, said Dangle. Well, said Phipps, one fellow had got hold of a queer story of a man in bicycling clothes, who was asking the same question about this time yesterday. What question? Said Mrs. Milton, in the shadow of the window. She spoke in a low voice, almost a whisper. Why, have you seen a young lady in a grey bicycling costume? Dangle caught at his lower lip. What's that? He said. Yesterday? A man asking about her then? What can that mean? Heaven knows, said Phipps, sitting down wearily. You'd better infer. What kind of man? Said Dangle. How should I know? In bicycling costume, the fellow said. But what height? What complexion? Didn't ask, said Phipps. Didn't ask? Nonsense, said Dangle. Ask him yourself, said Phipps. He was an ostler chap in the White Hart, short, thick-set fellow, with a red face and a crusty manner. Leaning up against the stable door, smells of whisky. Go and ask him. Of course, said Dangle, taking his straw hat from the shade over the stuffed bird on the chiffonier and turning towards the door. I might have known. Phipps's mouth opened and shut. You're tired, I'm sure, Mr. Phipps, said the lady soothingly. Let me ring for some tea for you. It suddenly occurred to Phipps that he had lapsed a little from his chivalry. I was a little annoyed at the way he rushed me to do all this business, he said, but I'd do 100 times as much if it would bring you any nearer to her. Pause. I would like a little tea. I don't want to raise any false hopes, said Widgery, but I do not believe they even came to Chichester. Dangle's a very clever fellow, of course, but sometimes these inferences are— Chuck! Said Phipps suddenly. What is it? Said Mrs. Milton. Something I've forgotten. I went right out of here, went to every other hotel in the place, and never thought. But never mind. I'll ask when the waiter comes. You don't mean— A tap, and the door opened. Tea, ma'am? Yes, ma'am, said the waiter. 1 minute, said Phipps. Was a lady in grey, a cycling lady, stopped here yesterday? Yes, sir, stopped the night with her brother, sir, a young gent. Brother? Said Mrs. Milton in a low tone. Thank God. The waiter glanced at her and understood everything. A young gent, sir, he said, very free with his money. Give the name of Beaumont. He proceeded to some rambling particulars and was cross-examined by Widgery on the plans of the young couple. Haven't? Where's haven't? Said Phipps. I seem to remember it somewhere. Was the man tall? Said Mrs. Milton intently. Distinguished-looking, with a long flaxen moustache, and spoke with a drawl. Well, said the waiter, and thought. His moustache, mum, was scarcely long, scrubby more, and young-looking. About 35 he was. No, ma'am, more like 25, not that. Dear me, said Mrs. Milton, speaking in a curious hollow voice, fumbling for her salts, and showing the finest self-control. It must have been her younger brother. Must have been. That will do, thank you, said Widgery officiously, feeling that she would be easier under this new surprise if the man were dismissed. The waiter turned to go, and almost collided with Dangle, who was entering the room, panting excitedly and with a pocket handkerchief held to his right eye. Hello, said Dangle. What's up? What's up with you? Said Phipps. Nothing. An altercation merely with that drunken ostler of yours. He thought it was a plot to annoy him, that the young lady in grey was mythical, judged from your manner. I've got a piece of raw meat to keep over it. You have some news, I see. Did the man hit you? Asked Widgery. Mrs. Milton rose and approached Dangle. Cannot I do anything? Dangle was heroic. Only tell me your news, he said, round the corner of the handkerchief. It was in this way, said Phipps, and explained rather sheepishly. While he was doing so, with the running-fire commentary from Widgery, the waiter brought in a tray of tea. A timetable, said Dangle promptly, for haven't. Mrs. Milton poured 2 cups, and Phipps and Dangle partook in Passover form. They caught the train by a hair's breadth. So to Havant and inquiries. Dangle was puffed up to find that his guess of Havant was right. In view of the fact that beyond Havant the Southampton road has a steep hill continuously on the right-hand side, and the sea on the left, he hit upon a magnificent scheme for heading the young folks off. He and Mrs. Milton would go to Fareham. Widgery and Phipps should alight one each at the intermediate stations of Cosham and Porchester, and come on by the next train if they had no news. If they did not come, a wire to the Fareham post office was to explain why. It was Napoleonic, and more than consoled Dangle for the open derision of the Havant street boys at the handkerchief which protected his damaged eye. Moreover, the scheme answered to perfection. The fugitives escaped by a hair's breadth. They were outside the Golden Anchor at Fareham and preparing to mount, and Mrs. Milton and Dangle came round the corner from the station. "It's her," said Mrs. Milton, and would have screamed. "Hist," said Dangle, gripping the lady's arm, removing his handkerchief in his excitement, and leaving the piece of meat over his eye. An extraordinary appearance, which seemed unexpectedly to calm her. "Be cool," said Dangle, glaring under the meat. "They must not see us. They will get away else." Were there flies at the station? The young couple mounted and vanished round the corner of the Winchester Road. Had it not been for the publicity of the business, Mrs. Milton would have fainted. "Save her," she said. "Ah, a conveyance," said Dangle. "1 minute." He left her in a most pathetic attitude with her hand pressed to her heart, and rushed into the Golden Anchor. Dog-cart in 10 minutes. Emerged. The meat had gone now, and one saw the cooling puffiness over his eye. "I will conduct you back to the station," said Dangle. "Hurry back there and pursue them. You will meet Widgery and Phipps, and tell them I am in pursuit." She was whirled back to the railway station and left there on a hard, blistered, wooden seat in the sun. She felt tired and dreadfully ruffled and agitated and dusty. Dangle was, no doubt, most energetic and devoted, but for a kindly, helpful manner commended her to Douglas Widgery. Meanwhile Dangle, his face golden in the evening sun, was driving, as well as he could, a large black horse harnessed into a thing called a gig, north-westward towards Winchester. Dangle, bearing his swollen eye, was a refined-looking little man, and he wore a deerstalker cap and was dressed in dark grey. His neck was long and slender. Perhaps you know what gigs are. Huge, big wooden things, and very high, and the horse, too, was huge and big and high, with knobbly legs, a long face, a hard mouth, and a whacking trick of pacing. Smack, 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 smack it went along the road, and hard by the church it shied vigorously at a hooded perambulator. The history of the rescue expedition now becomes confused. It appears that Widgery was extremely indignant to find Mrs. Milton left about upon the Fareham platform. The day had irritated him somehow, though he had started with the noblest intentions, and he seemed glad to find an outlet for justifiable indignation. "He's such a spasmodic creature," said Widgery, "rushing off, and I suppose we're to wait here until he comes back. It's likely. He's so egotistical, is Dangle, always wants to mismanage everything himself." "He means to help me," said Mrs. Milton, a little reproachfully touching his arm. Widgery was hardly in the mood to be mollified all at once. "He need not prevent me," he said, and stopped. "It's no good talking, you know, and you are tired." "I can go on," she said brightly, "if only we find her." "While I was cooling my heels in Cosham, I brought a county map." He produced and opened it. "Here, you see, is the road out of Fareham." He proceeded with the calm deliberation of a businessman to develop a proposal of taking a train forthwith to Winchester. They must be going to Winchester, he explained. It was inevitable. Tomorrow, Sunday, Winchester was a cathedral town, and the road was going nowhere else of the slightest importance. But Mr. Dangle, he will simply go on until he has to pass something, and then he will break his neck. I have never seen Dangle drive before. It's scarcely likely a dog cart, especially a hired dog cart, will overtake bicycles in the cool of the evening. Rely upon me, Mrs. Milton. I am in your hands, she said, with pathetic littleness, looking up at him, and for the moment he forgot the exasperation of the day. Phipps, during this conversation, had stood in a somewhat depressed attitude, leaning on his stick, feeling his collar, and looking from one speaker to the other. The idea of leaving Dangle behind seemed to him an excellent one. We might leave a message at the place where he got the dog-cart, he suggested, when he saw their eyes meeting. There was a cheerful alacrity about all three at the proposal. But they never got beyond Botley, for even as their train ran into the station, a mighty rumbling was heard. There was a shouting overhead. The guard stood astonished on the platform, and Phipps, thrusting his head out of the window, cried, "There he goes!" and sprang out of the carriage. Mrs. Milton, following in alarm, just saw it. From Widgery it was hidden. Botley Station lies in a cutting. Overhead was the roadway, and across the lemon yellows and flushed pinks of the sunset there whirled a great black mass, a horse like a long-nosed chestnut, the upper workings of a gig, and Dangle in transit from front to back. A monstrous shadow aped him across the cutting. It was the event of a second. Dangle seemed to jump, hang in the air momentarily, and vanish, and after a moment's pause came a heart-rending smash. Then, two black heads running swiftly. "Better get out," said Phipps to Mrs. Milton. In another moment, all three were hurrying up the steps. They found Dangle, hatless, standing up with cut hands extended, having his hands brushed by an officious small boy. A broad, ugly road ran downhill in a long vista, and in the distance was a little group of Botley inhabitants holding the big black horse. Even at that distance they could see the expression of conscious pride on the monster's visage. It was a wooden-faced horse, as you can imagine. The beasts in the Tower of London, on which the men in armour are perched, are the only horses I have ever seen at all like it. However, we are not concerned now with the horse, but with Dangle. "Hurt?" asked Phipps, eagerly leading. "Mr. Dangle!" cried Mrs. Milton, clasping her hands. "Hello," said Dangle, not surprised in the slightest. "Glad you've come. I may want you. Bit of a mess I'm in, eh? But I've caught 'em, at the very place I expected to." "Caught 'em?" said Widgery. "Where are they?" "Up there," he said, with a backward motion of his head. "About a mile up the hill. I left 'em. I had to." "I don't understand," said Mrs. Milton, with that rapt, painful look again. "Have you found Jessie?" "I have. I wish I could wash the gravel out of my hands somewhere. It was like this, you know. Came on them suddenly round a corner. Horse shied at the bicycles. They were sitting by the roadside botanising flowers. I had just time to shout, 'Jessie Milton, we've been looking for you.' And then that confounded brute bolted. I didn't dare turn round. I had all my work to do to save myself being turned over, as it was. So long as I did, I just shouted, 'Return to your friends, all will be forgiven,' and off I came, clatter, clatter. Whether they heard—" "Take me to her," said Mrs. Milton with intensity, turning towards Widgery. "Certainly," said Widgery, suddenly becoming active. "How far is it, Dangle?" "1.5 or 2 miles. I was determined to find them, you know. I say, though, look at my hands. But I beg your pardon, Mrs. Milton." He turned to Phipps. "Phipps, I say, where shall I wash the gravel out? And have a look at my knee." "There's the station," said Phipps, becoming helpful. Dangle made a step, and a damaged knee became evident. "Take my arm," said Phipps. "Where can we get a conveyance?" asked Widgery of two small boys. The two small boys failed to understand. They looked at one another. "There's not a cab, not a go-kart in sight," said Widgery. "It's a case of a horse my kingdom for a horse." "There's a horse all right," said one of the small boys with a movement of the head. "Don't you know where we can hire traps?" asked Widgery. "Or a cart or anything?" asked Mrs. Milton. "John Hooker's got a cart, but no one can't iron," said the larger of the small boys, partially averting his face and staring down the road and making a song of it. "And so's my father, for's leg us broke." "Not a cart even, evidently. What shall we do?" It occurred to Mrs. Milton that if Widgery was the man for courtly devotion, Dangle was infinitely readier of resource. "I suppose," she said timidly, "perhaps if you were to ask Mr. Dangle—" And then all the guilt came off Widgery. He answered quite rudely, "Confound Dangle! Hasn't he messed up enough? He must needs drive after them in a trap to tell them we're coming, and now you want me to ask him?" Her beautiful blue eyes were filled with tears. He stopped abruptly. "I'll go and ask Dangle," he said shortly, "if you wish it," and went striding into the station and down the steps, leaving her in the road under the quiet inspection of the two little boys, and with a kind of ballad refrain running through her head. "Where are the knights of the olden time?" and feeling tired to death and hungry and dusty and out of curl, and, in short, a martyr woman. Chapter 31. It goes to my heart to tell of the end of that day, how the fugitives vanished into immensity, how there was no more trains, how Botley stared unsympathetically with a palpable disposition to derision, denying conveyances, how the landlord of the Heron was suspicious, how the next day was Sunday, and the hot summer's day had crumpled the collar of Phipps and stained the skirts of Mrs. Milton and dimmed the radiant emotions of the whole party. Dangle, with sticking plaster and black eye, felt the absurdity of the pose of the wounded knight and abandoned it after the faintest efforts. Recriminations never, perhaps, held the foreground of the talk, but they played like summer lightning on the edge of the conversation, and deep in the hearts of all was the galling sense of the ridiculous. Jessie, they thought, was most to blame. Apparently, too, the worst, which would have made the whole business tragic, was not happening. Here was a young woman do I say, a mere girl, had chosen to leave a comfortable home in Surbiton and all the delights of a refined and intellectual circle, and had rushed off, trailing us after her, posing hard, mutually jealous and now tired and weather-worn, to flick us off at last, mere mud from her wheel, into that detestable village beer-house on a Saturday night. And she had done it, not for love and passion, which are serious excuses one may recognize, even if one must reprobate, but just for a freak, just for a fantastic idea, for nothing, in fact, but the outraging of common sense. Yet withal, such was our restraint, that we talked of her still as one much misguided, as one who burthened us with anxiety as a lamb astray, and Mrs. Milton, having eaten, continued to show the finest feelings on the matter. She sat, I may mention, in the cushioned basket chair, the only comfortable chair in the room, and we sat on incredibly hard, horsehair things, having antimacassars tied to their backs by means of lemon-coloured bows. It was different from those dear old talks at Surbiton, somehow. She sat facing the window, which was open. The night was so tranquil and warm, and the dim light, for we did not use the lamp, suited her admirably. She talked in a voice that told you she was tired, and she seemed inclined to state a case against herself in the matter of a soul untrammelled. It was such an evening as might live in a sympathetic memoir, but it was a little dull while it lasted. "I feel," she said, "that I am to blame. I have developed. That first book of mine, I do not go back upon a word of it, mind, but it has been misunderstood, misapplied." "It has?" said Widgery, trying to look so deeply sympathetic as to be visible in the dark. "Deliberately misunderstood?" "Don't say that," said the lady, "not deliberately. I try and think that critics are honest, after their lights. I was not thinking of critics, but she paused an interrogation. "It is possible," said Dangle, scrutinizing his sticking plaster. "I write a book and state a case. I want people to think as I recommend, not to do as I recommend. It is just teaching, only I make it into a story. I want to teach new ideas, new lessons, to promulgate ideas. Then, when the ideas have been spread abroad, things will come about. Only now it is madness to fly in the face of the established order. Bernard Shaw, you know, has explained that with regard to socialism. We all know that to earn all you consume is right, and that living on invested capital is wrong. Only we cannot begin while we are so few. It is those others." "Precisely," said Widgery. "It is those others. They must begin first." "And meanwhile you go on banking." "If I didn't, someone else would." "And I live on Mr. Milton's lotion while I try to gain a footing in literature." "Try?" said Phipps. "You have done so." And "That's different," said Dangle at the same time. "You are so kind to me, but in this matter. Of course, Georgina Griffiths in my book lived alone in a flat in Paris, and went to life classes and had men visitors. But then, she was over 21. "Jessica is only 17, and girlish for that," said Dangle. "It alters everything. That child. It is different with a woman, and Georgina Griffiths never flaunted her freedom, on a bicycle, in country places. In this country, where everyone is so particular. Fancy sleeping away from home. It's dreadful. If it gets about, it spells ruin for her." "Ruin," said Widgery. "No man would marry a girl like that," said Phipps. "It must be hushed up," said Dangle. "It always seems to me that life is made up of individuals, of individual cases. We must weigh each person against his or her circumstances. General rules don't apply." "I often feel the force of that," said Widgery. "Those are my rules. Of course my books. It's different, altogether different," said Dangle. "A novel deals with typical classes." "And life is not typical," said Widgery with immense profundity. Then suddenly, unintentionally, being himself most surprised and shocked of any in the room, Phipps yawned. The failing was infectious, and the gathering, having, as you can easily understand, talked itself weary, dispersed on trivial pretences. But not to sleep immediately. Directly Dangle was alone, he began, with infinite disgust, to scrutinize his darkling eye, for he was a neat-minded little man in spite of his energy. The whole business, so near a capture, was horribly vexatious. Phipps sat on his bed for some time examining, with equal disgust, a collar he would have thought incredible for Sunday 24 hours before. Mrs. Milton fell a musing on the mortality of even big fat men with dog-like eyes, and Widgery was unhappy because he had been so cross to her at the station, and because so far he did not feel he had scored over Dangle. Also, he was angry with Dangle. And all four of them, being souls living very much upon the appearances of things, had a painful mental middle distance of Botley derisive and suspicious, and a remoter background of London humorous. and Surbiton speculative. Were they really, after all, behaving absurdly? Chapter 32. Mr. Hoopdriver, Knight Errant. As Mr. Dangle had witnessed, the fugitives had been left by him by the side of the road about 2 miles from Botley. Before Mr. Dangle's appearance, Mr. Hoopdriver had been learning with great interest that mere roadside flowers had names: starflowers, wind stars, St. John's wort, willow herb, lords and ladies, bachelor's buttons, most curious names, some of them. The flowers are all different in South Africa, you know, he was explaining with a happy fluke of his imagination to account for his ignorance. Then suddenly, heralded by clattering sounds and a gride of wheels, Dangle had flared and thundered across the tranquillity of the summer evening. Dangle, swaying and gesticulating behind a corybantic black horse, had hailed Jessie by her name, had backed towards the hedge for no ostensible reason, and vanished to the accomplishment of the fate that had been written down for him from the very beginning of things. Jessie and Hoopdriver had scarcely time to stand up and seize their machines before this tumultuous, this swift and wonderful passing of Dangle was achieved. He went from side to side of the road, worse even than the riding forth of Mr. Hoopdriver it was, and vanished round the corner. "He knew my name," said Jessie. "Yes, it was Mr. Dangle." "That was our bicycles did that," said Mr. Hoopdriver simultaneously, and speaking with a certain complacent concern. "I hope he won't get hurt." "That was Mr. Dangle," repeated Jessie, and Mr. Hoopdriver heard this time, with a violent start. His eyebrows went up spasmodically. "What? Someone you know?" "Yes." "Lord!" "He was looking for me," said Jessie. "I could see. He began to call me before the horse shied. My stepmother has sent him." Mr. Hoopdriver wished he had returned the bicycle after all, for his ideas were still a little hazy about Betchamel and Mrs. Milton. Honesty is the best policy often, he thought. He turned his head this way and that. He became active. "After us, eh? Then he'll come back. He's gone down that hill, and he won't be able to pull up for a bit, I'm certain." Jessie, he saw, had wheeled her machine into the road and was mounting. Still staring at the corner that had swallowed up Dangle, Hoopdriver followed suit. And so, just as the sun was setting, they began another flight together, riding now towards Bishop Waltham, Mr. Hoopdriver in the post of danger, the rear, ever and again looking over his shoulder and swerving dangerously as he did so. Occasionally, Jessie had to slacken her pace. He breathed heavily and hated himself because his mouth fell open, and after an hour's hard riding, they found themselves uncaught at Winchester. Not a trace of Dangle nor any other danger was visible as they rode into the dusky, yellow-lit street. Though the bats had been fluttering behind the hedges, and the evening star was bright while they were still 2 miles from Winchester, Mr. Hoopdriver pointed out the dangers of stopping in such an obvious abiding place, and gently but firmly insisted upon replenishing the lamps and riding on towards Salisbury. From Winchester, roads branch in every direction, and to turn abruptly westward was clearly the way to throw off the chase. As Hoopdriver saw the moon rising broad and yellow through the twilight, he thought he should revive the effect of that ride out of Bognor, but somehow, albeit the moon and all the atmospheric effects were the same, the emotions were different. They rode in absolute silence, and slowly after they had cleared the outskirts of Winchester. Both of them were now nearly tired out. The level was tedious, and even a little hill a burden, and so it came about that in the hamlet of Wallenstock they were beguiled to stop and ask for accommodation in an exceptionally prosperous-looking village inn. A plausible landlady rose to the occasion. Now, as they passed into the room where their suppers were prepared, Mr. Hoopdriver caught a glimpse through a door ajar and floating in a reek of smoke of 3.5 faces, for the edge of the door cut one down, and an American cloth-covered table with several glasses and a tankard, and he also heard a remark. In the second before he heard that remark, Mr. Hoopdriver had been a proud and happy man, to particularize a baronet's air incognito. He had surrendered their bicycles to the old man of the place with infinite easy dignity, and had bowingly opened the door for Jessie. "Who's that, then?" he imagined people saying, and then, "Someone pretty well off, judged by the bicycles." Then the imaginary spectators would fall a-talking of the fashionableness of bicycling, how judges and stockbrokers and actresses and, in fact, all the best people rode, and how that it was often the fancy of such great folk to shun the big hotels, the adulation of urban crowds, and seek incognito the cosy quaintness of village life. Then maybe they would think of a certain nameless air of distinction about the lady who had stepped across the doorway, and about the handsome, flaxen-moustached, blue-eyed cavalier who had followed her in, and they would look one to another. "Tell you what it is," one of the village elders would say, just as they do in novels, voicing the thought of all in a low, impressive tone. "There's such a thing as entertaining baronets unawares, not to mention no higher things." Such, I say, had been the filmy, delightful stuff in Mr. Hoopdriver's head the moment before he heard that remark. But the remark toppled him headlong. What the precise remark was need not concern us. It was a casual piece of such satire as Stephron delights in. Should you be curious, dear lady, as to its nature, you have merely to dress yourself in a really modern cycling costume, get one of the feeblest-looking of your men to escort you, and ride out next Saturday evening to any public house where healthy, homely people gather together. Then you will hear quite a lot of the kind of thing Mr. Hoopdriver heard, more possibly than you will desire. The remark, I must add, implicated Mr. Hoopdriver. It indicated an entire disbelief in his social standing. At a blow, it shattered all the gorgeous, imaginative fabric his mind had been rejoicing in. All that foolish happiness vanished like a dream, and there was nothing to show for it, as there is nothing to show for any spiteful remark that has ever been made. Perhaps the man who said the thing had a gleam of satisfaction at the idea of taking a complacent-looking fool down a peg, but it is just as possible he did not know at the time that his stray shot had hit. He had thrown it as a boy throws a stone at a bird, and it not only demolished a foolish, happy conceit, but it wounded. It touched Jessie grossly. She did not hear it, he concluded from her subsequent bearing, but during the supper they had in the little private dining-room, though she talked cheerfully, he was preoccupied. Whiffs of distinct conversation, and now and then laughter, came in from the inn-parlour through the pelargoniums in the open window. Hoopdriver felt it must be all in the same strain, at her expense and his. He answered her abstractly. She was tired, she said, and presently went to her room. Mr. Hoopdriver, in his courtly way, opened the door for her and bowed her out. He stood listening and fearing some new offence as she went upstairs and round the bend where the barometer hung beneath the stuffed birds. Then he went back to the room and stood on the hearth-rug before the paper fireplace ornament. "Cads," he said in a scathing undertone, as a fresh burst of laughter came floating in. All through supper he had been composing stinging repartee, a blistering speech of denunciation, to be presently delivered. He would rate them as noblemen should. "Call themselves Englishmen, indeed, and insult a woman," he would say, take the names and addresses perhaps, threaten to speak to the lord of the manor, promise to let them hear from him again, and so out with consternation in his wake. It really ought to be done. "Teach 'em better," he said fiercely, and tweaked his moustache painfully. What was it? He revived the objectionable remark for his own exasperation, and then went over the heads of his speech again. He coughed, made 3 steps towards the door, then stopped and went back to the hearth-rug. He wouldn't, after all. Yet was he not a knight-errant? Should such men go unreproved, unchecked by wandering baronets incognito? Magnanimity? Look at it in that way? Churls beneath one's notice? No, merely a cowardly subterfuge. He would, after all. Something within him protested that he was a hot-headed ass even as he went towards the door again. But he only went on the more resolutely. He crossed the hall, by the bar, and entered the room from which the remark had proceeded. He opened the door abruptly, and stood scowling on them in the doorway. "You'll only make a mess of it," remarked the internal sceptic. There were 5 men in the room altogether, a fat person with a long pipe and a great number of chins, in an armchair by the fireplace, who wished Mr. Hoopdriver a very good evening very affably. A young fellow smoking a cutty and displaying crossed legs with gaiters. A little bearded man with a toothless laugh, a middle-aged, comfortable man with bright eyes, who wore a velveteen jacket, and a fair young man, very genteel, in a yellowish-brown ready-made suit, and a white tie. Said Mr. Hoopdriver, looking very stern and harsh, and then, in a forbidding tone, as one who consented to no liberties, "Good evening." "Very pleasant day we've been having," said the fair young man with the white tie. "Very," said Mr. Hoopdriver slowly, and taking a brown armchair, he planted it with great deliberation where he faced the fireplace, and sat down. Let's see, how did that speech begin? "Very pleasant roads about here," said the fair young man with the white tie. "Very," said Mr. Hoopdriver, eyeing him darkly. "Have to begin somehow. The roads about here are all right, and the weather about here is all right, but what I've come in here to say is, there's some damned unpleasant people. Damned unpleasant people." "Oh," said the young man with the gaiters, apparently making a mental inventory of his pearl buttons as he spoke. "How's that?" Mr. Hoopdriver put his hands on his knees and stuck out his elbows with extreme angularity. In his heart he was raving at his idiotic folly at thus bearding these lions. Indisputably they were lions, but he had to go through with it now. Heaven send his breath, which was already getting a trifle spasmodic, did not suddenly give out. He fixed his eye on the face of the fat man with the chins, and spoke in a low, impressive voice. "I came here, sir," said Mr. Hoopdriver, and paused to inflate his cheeks, "with a lady." "Very nice lady," said the man with the gaiters, putting his head on one side to admire a pearl button that had been hiding behind the curvature of his calf. "Very nice lady indeed." "I came here," said Mr. Hoopdriver, "with a lady." "We saw you did, bless you," said the fat man with the chins, in a curious wheezy voice. "I don't see there's anything so very extraordinary in that. One'd think we hadn't eyes." Mr. Hoopdriver coughed. "I came here, sir." "We've heard that," said the little man with the beard sharply, and went off into an amiable chuckle. "We know it by heart," said the little man, elaborating the point. Mr. Hoopdriver temporarily lost his thread. He glared malignantly at the little man with the beard, and tried to recover his discourse. A pause. "You were saying," said the fair young man with the white tie, speaking very politely, "that you came here with a lady." "A lady," meditated the gaiter-gazer. The man in velveteen, who was looking from one speaker to another with keen bright eyes, now laughed as though a point had been scored, and stimulated Mr. Hoopdriver to speak by fixing him with an expectant regard. "Some dirty cad," said Mr. Hoopdriver, proceeding with his discourse and suddenly growing extremely fierce, "made a remark as we went by this door." "Steady on," said the old gentleman with many chins. "Steady on, don't you go calling us names, please." "1 minute," said Mr. Hoopdriver. "It wasn't I began calling names." "Who did?" said the man with the chins. "I'm not calling any of you dirty cads. Don't run away with that impression. Only some person in this room made a remark that showed he wasn't fit to wipe boots on. And, with all due deference to such gentlemen as our gentlemen." Mr. Hoopdriver looked round for moral support. "I want to know which it was." "Meaning," said the young man in the white tie. "That I'm going to wipe my boots on him straight away," said Mr. Hoopdriver, reverting to anger, if with a slight catch in his throat, than which threat of personal violence nothing had been further from his thoughts on entering the room. He said this because he could think of nothing else to say, and stuck out his elbows truculently to hide the sinking of his heart. It is curious how situations run away with us. "Hullo, Charlie," said the little man, and "My eye," said the owner of the chins. "You're going to wipe your boots on him," said the fair young man in a tone of mild surprise. "I am," said Mr. Hoopdriver with emphatic resolution, and glared in the young man's face. "That's fair and reasonable," said the man in the velveteen jacket, "if you can." The interest of the meeting seemed transferred to the young man in the white tie. "Of course, if you can't find out which it is, I suppose you're prepared to wipe your boots in a liberal way on everybody in the room," said this young man, in the same tone of impersonal question. "This gentleman, the champion lightweight." "Own up, Charlie," said the young man with the gaiters, looking up for a moment, "and don't go a-dragging in your betters. It's fair and square. You can't get out of it." "Was it this gent?" began Mr. Hoopdriver. "Of course," said the young man in the white tie. "When it comes to talking of wiping boots—" "I'm not talking, I'm going to do it," said Mr. Hoopdriver. He looked round at the meeting. They were no longer antagonists, they were spectators. He would have to go through with it now, but this tone of personal aggression on the maker of the remark had somehow got rid of the oppressive feeling of Hoopdriver contra mundum. Apparently, he would have to fight someone. Would he get a black eye? Would he get very much hurt? Pray goodness it wasn't that sturdy chap in the gaiters. Should he rise and begin? What would she think if he brought a black eye to breakfast tomorrow? "Is this the man?" said Mr. Hoopdriver, with a business-like calm, and arms more angular than ever. "Eat him," said the little man with the beard. "Eat him straight off." "Steady on," said the young man in the white tie. "Steady on a minute." "If I did happen to say—" "You did you?" said Mr. Hoopdriver. "Backing out of it, Charlie," said the young man with the gaiters. "Not a bit," said Charlie. "Surely we can pass a bit of a joke." "I'm going to teach you to keep your jokes to yourself," said Mr. Hoopdriver. "Bravo," said the shepherd of the flock of chins. "Charlie is a bit too free with his jokes," said the little man with the beard. "It's downright disgusting," said Hoopdriver, falling back upon his speech. "A lady can't ride a bicycle in a country road or wear a dress a little out of the ordinary, but every dirty little greaser must needs go shouting insults." "I didn't know the young lady would hear what I said," said Charlie. "Surely one can speak friendly to one's friends." "How was I to know the door was open?" Hoopdriver began to suspect that his antagonist was, if possible, more seriously alarmed at the prospect of violence than himself, and his spirits rose again. These chaps ought to have a thorough lesson. "Of course you knew the door was open," he retorted indignantly. "Of course you thought we should hear what you said. Don't go telling lies about it. It's no good your saying things like that. You've had your fun, and you've meant to have your fun, and I mean to make an example of you, sir." "Ginger beer," said the little man with the beard in a confidential tone to the velveteen jacket, "is regular up this hot weather. Busting its bottles, it is everywhere." "What's the good of scrapping about in a public house?" said Charlie, appealing to the company. "A fair fight without interruptions. Now I wouldn't mind if the gentleman so disposed." Evidently, the man was horribly afraid. Mr. Hoopdriver grew truculent. "Where would you like?" said Mr. Hoopdriver. "Just wherever you like." "You insulted the gent," said the man in velveteen. "Don't be a bloomin' funk, Charlie," said the man in gaiters. "Why, you got a stone of him, if you got an ounce." "What I say is this," said the gentleman with the excessive chins, trying to get a hearing by banging his chair arms. "If Charlie goes saying things, he ought to back 'em up. That's what I say. I don't mind his saying such things at all, but he ought to be prepared to back 'em up." "I'll back him up all right," said Charlie, with extremely bitter emphasis on back, "if the gentleman likes to come Tuesday week." "Rot," chopped in Hoopdriver. "Now." "'Ere, 'ere," said the owner of the chins. "Never put off tomorrow, Charlie, what you can do today," said the man in the velveteen coat. "You got to do it, Charlie," said the man in gaiters. "It's no good." "It's like this," said Charlie, appealing to everyone except Hoopdriver. "Here's me, got to take in her ladyship's dinner tomorrow night. How should I look with a black eye? And going round with a carriage with a split lip. If you don't want your face spilled, Charlie, why don't you keep your mouth shut?" said the person in gaiters. "Exactly," said Mr. Hoopdriver, driving it home with great fierceness. "Why don't you shut your ugly mouth? It's as much as my situation's worth," protested Charlie. "You should have thought about that before," said Hoopdriver. "There's no occasion to be so thundering hot about it. I only meant the thing joking," said Charlie. "As one gentleman to another, I'm very sorry if the gentleman's annoyed." Everybody began to speak at once. Mr. Hoopdriver twirled his moustache. He felt that Charlie's recognition of his gentlemanliness was at any rate a redeeming feature, but it became his pose to ride hard and heavy over the routed foe. He shouted some insulting phrase over the tumult. "You're regular abject," the man in gaiters was saying to Charlie. More confusion. "Only don't think I'm afraid, not of a spindle-legged cuss like him," shouted Charlie, "because I ain't." "Change of front," thought Hoopdriver, a little startled. "Where are we going?" "Don't sit there and be abusive," said the man in velveteen. "He's offered to hit you, and if I was him, I'd hit you now." "All right then," said Charlie, with a sudden change of front, and springing to his feet. "If I must, I must. Now then." At that, Hoopdriver, the child of fate, rose too, with a horrible sense that his internal monitor was right. Things had taken a turn. He had made a mess of it, and now there was nothing for it, so far as he could see, but to hit the man at once. He and Charlie stood 6 feet apart, with a table between, both very breathless and fierce. A vulgar fight in a public house, and with what was only too palpably a footman. Good heavens! And this was the dignified, scornful remonstrance. How the deuce had it all happened? Go round the table at him, I suppose. But before the brawl could achieve itself, the man in gaiters intervened. "Not here," he said, stepping between the antagonists. Everyone was standing up. "Charlie's artful," said the little man with the beard. "Buller's yard," said the man with the gaiters, taking the control of the entire affair with the easy readiness of an accomplished practitioner. "If the gentleman don't mind." Buller's yard, it seemed, was the very place. "We'll do the thing regular and decent, if you please." And before he completely realised what was happening, Hoopdriver was being marched out through the back premises of the inn to the first and only fight with fists that was ever going to glorify his life. Outwardly, so far as the intermittent moonlight showed, Mr. Hoopdriver was quietly but eagerly prepared to fight. But inwardly he was a chaos of conflicting purposes. It was extraordinary how things happened. One remark had trod so closely on the heels of another that he had had the greatest difficulty in following the development of the business. He distinctly remembered himself walking across from one room to the other, a dignified, even an aristocratic figure, primed with considered eloquence, intent upon a scathing remonstrance to these wretched yokels regarding their manners. Then incident had flickered into incident until here he was, out in a moonlight lane, a slight dark figure in a group of larger, indistinct figures, marching in a quiet, businesslike way towards some unknown horror at Buller's Yard. Fists! It was astonishing! It was terrible! In front of him was the pallid figure of Charles, and he saw that the man in gaiters held Charles kindly but firmly by the arm. "It's blasted rot," Charles was saying, "getting up a fight just for a thing like that. All very well for him, he's got his holidays. He hasn't no blessed dinner to take up tomorrow night like I have. No need to numb my arm, is there?" They went into Buller's Yard through gates. There were sheds in Buller's Yard, sheds of mystery that the moonlight could not solve. A smell of cows, and a pump stood out clear and black, throwing a clear black shadow on the whitewashed wall. And here it was, his face was to be battered to a pulp. He knew this was the uttermost folly, to stand up here and be pounded, but the way out of it was beyond his imagining. Yet afterwards, could he ever face her again? He patted his Norfolk jacket and took his ground with his back to the gate. How did one square? So, suppose one were to turn and run even now, run straight back to the inn and lock himself into his bedroom. They couldn't make him come out anyhow. He could prosecute them for assault if they did. How did one set about prosecuting for assault? He saw Charles, with his face ghastly white under the moon, squaring in front of him. He caught a blow on the arm and gave ground. Charles pressed him. Then he hit with his right and with the violence of despair. It was a hit of his own devising, an impromptu, but it chanced to coincide with a regulation hook hit at the head. He perceived with a leap of exultation that the thing his fist had met was the jawbone of Charles. It was the sole gleam of pleasure he experienced during the fight, and it was quite momentary. He had hardly got home upon Charles before he was struck in the chest and whirled backward. He had the greatest difficulty in keeping his feet. He felt that his heart was smashed flat. "Good damn," said somebody, dancing toe in hand somewhere behind him. As Mr. Hoopdriver staggered, Charles gave a loud and fear-compelling cry. He seemed to tower over Hoopdriver in the moonlight. Both his fists were whirling. It was annihilation coming, no less. Mr. Hoopdriver ducked, perhaps and certainly gave ground to the right, hit and missed. Charles swept round to the left, missing generously. A blow glanced over Mr. Hoopdriver's left ear, and the flanking movement was completed. Another blow behind the ear. Heaven and earth spun furiously round Mr. Hoopdriver, and then he became aware of a figure in a light suit shooting violently through an open gate into the night. The man in gaiters sprang forward past Mr. Hoopdriver, but too late to intercept the fugitive. There were shouts, laughter, and Mr. Hoopdriver, still solemnly squaring, realized the great and wonderful truth. Charles had fled. He, Hoopdriver, had fought, and, by all the rules of war, had won. "That was a pretty cut under the jaw you gave him," the toothless little man with the beard was remarking in an unexpectedly friendly manner. "The fact of it is," said Mr. Hoopdriver, sitting beside the road to Salisbury, and with the sound of distant church bells in his ears, "I had to give the fellow a lesson, simply had to." "It seems so dreadful that you should have to knock people about," said Jessie. "These louts get unbearable," said Mr. Hoopdriver. "If now and then we didn't give them a lesson, well, a lady cyclist in the roads would be an impossibility." "I suppose every woman shrinks from violence," said Jessie. "I suppose men are braver in a way than women. It seems to me, I can't imagine how one could bring oneself to face a roomful of rough characters, pick out the bravest, and give him an exemplary thrashing. I quail at the idea. I thought only Ouida's guardsmen did things like that. It was nothing more than my duty as a gentleman," said Mr. Hoopdriver. but to walk straight into the face of danger. It's habit, said Mr. Hoopdriver, quite modestly, flicking off a particle of cigarette ash that had settled on his knee. Chapter 33. The Abasement of Mr. Hoopdriver. On Monday morning, the two fugitives found themselves breakfasting at the Golden Pheasant in Blandford. They were in the course of an elaborate doubling movement through Dorsetshire towards Ringwood, where Jessie anticipated an answer from her schoolmistress friend. By this time they had been nearly 60 hours together, and you will understand that Mr. Hoopdriver's feelings had undergone a considerable intensification and development. At first, Jessie had been only an impressionist sketch upon his mind, something feminine, active and dazzling, something emphatically above him, cast into his company by a kindly fate. His chief idea at the outset, as you know, had been to live up to her level, by pretending to be more exceptional, more wealthy, better educated, and, above all, better born than he was. His knowledge of the feminine mind was almost entirely derived from the young ladies he had met in business, and in that class, as in military society and among gentlemen's servants, the good old tradition of a brutal social exclusiveness is still religiously preserved. He had an almost intolerable dread of her thinking him a bounder. Later he began to perceive the distinction of her idiosyncrasies. Coupled with a magnificent want of experience was a splendid enthusiasm for abstract views of the most advanced description, and her strength of conviction completely carried Hoopdriver away. She was going to live her own life, with emphasis, and Mr. Hoopdriver was profoundly stirred to similar resolves. So soon as he grasped the tenor of her views, he perceived that he himself had thought as much from his earliest years. Of course, he remarked, in a flash of sexual pride, a man is freer than a woman. And in the colonies, you know, there isn't half the conventionality you find in society in this country. He made one or two essays in the display of unconventionality, and was quite unaware that he impressed her as a narrow-minded person. He suppressed the habits of years and made no proposal to go to church. He discussed church-going in a liberal spirit. "It's just a habit," he said, "just a custom. I don't see what good it does you at all, really." And he made a lot of excellent jokes at the chimney-pot hat, jokes he had read in the Globe turnovers on that subject. But he showed his gentle breeding by keeping his gloves on all through the Sunday's ride, and ostentatiously throwing away more than half a cigarette when they passed a church whose congregation was gathering for afternoon service. He cautiously avoided literary topics, except by way of compliment, seeing that she was presently to be writing books. It was on Jessie's initiative that they attended service in the old-fashioned gallery of Blandford Church. Jessie's conscience, I may perhaps tell you, was now suffering the severest twinges. She perceived clearly that things were not working out quite along the lines she had designed. She had read her Olive Schreiner and George Egerton, and so forth, with all the want of perfect comprehension of one who is still emotionally a girl. She knew the thing to do was to have a flat, and to go to the British Museum and write leading articles for the daily papers until something better came along. If Bechamel, detestable person, had kept his promises instead of behaving with unspeakable horridness, all would have been well. Now her only hope was that liberal-minded woman, Miss Mergle, who, a year ago, had sent her out, highly educated, into the world. Miss Mergle had told her at parting to live fearlessly and truly, and had further given her a volume of Emerson's Essays and Motley's Dutch Republic to help her through the rapids of adolescence. Jessie's feelings for her stepmother's household at Surbiton amounted to an active detestation. There are no graver or more solemn women in the world than these clever girls whose scholastic advancement has retarded their feminine coquetry. In spite of the advanced tone of Thomas Plantagenet's anti-marital novel, Jessie had speedily seen through that amiable woman's amiable defences. The variety of pose necessitated by the core of men annoyed her to an altogether unreasonable degree. To return to this life of ridiculous unreality, unconditional capitulation to conventionality, was an exasperating prospect. Yet what else was there to do? You will understand, therefore, that at times she was moody, and Mr. Hoopdriver respectfully silent and attentive, and at times inclined to eloquent denunciation of the existing order of things. She was a socialist, Hoopdriver learnt, and he gave a vague intimation that he went further, intending thereby no less than the horrors of anarchism. He would have owned up to the destruction of the Winter Palace indeed, had he had the faintest idea where the Winter Palace was, and had his assurance amounted to certainty that the Winter Palace was destroyed. He agreed with her cordially that the position of women was intolerable, but checked himself on the verge of the proposition that a girl ought not to expect a fellow to hand down boxes for her when he was getting the swap from a customer. It was Jessie's preoccupation with her own perplexities, no doubt, that delayed the unveiling of Mr. Hoopdriver all through Saturday and Sunday. Once or twice, however, there were incidents that put him about terribly, even questions that savoured of suspicion. On Sunday night, for no conceivable reason, an unwanted wakefulness came upon him. Unaccountably he realized he was a contemptible liar. All through the small hours of Monday he reviewed the tale of his falsehoods, and when he tried to turn his mind from that, the financial problem suddenly rose upon him. He heard 2 o'clock strike, and 3. It is odd how unhappy some of us are at times, when we are at our happiest. Chapter 34. "Good morning, madam," said Hoopdriver as Jessie came into the breakfast room of the Golden Pheasant on Monday morning, and he smiled, bowed, rubbed his hands together, and pulled out a chair for her, and rubbed his hands again. She stopped abruptly, with a puzzled expression on her face. "Where have I seen that before?" she said. "The chair?" said Hoopdriver, flushing. "No, the attitude." She came forward and shook hands with him, looking the while curiously into his face. "And madam." "It's a habit," said Mr. Hoopdriver guiltily. "A bad habit, calling ladies madam. You must put it down to our colonial roughness. Out there up country, you know, the ladies, so rare, we call 'em all madam." "You have some funny habits, brother Chris," said Jessie. "Before you sell your diamond shares and go into society, as you say, and stand for Parliament, what a fine thing it is to be a man, you must cure yourself. The habit of bowing as you do, and rubbing your hands, and looking expectant." "It's a habit." "I know, but I don't think it a good one. You don't mind me telling you?" "Not a bit. I'm grateful." "I am blessed or afflicted with a trick of observation," said Jessie, looking at the breakfast table. Mr. Hoopdriver put his hand to his moustache, and then, thinking this might be another habit, checked his arm and stuck his hand into his pocket. He felt deuced awkward, to use his private formula. Jessie's eye wandered to the armchair, where a piece of binding was loose, and, possibly to carry out her theory of an observant disposition, she turned and asked him for a pin. Mr. Hoopdriver's hand fluttered instinctively to his lapel, and there, planted by habit, were a couple of stray pins he had impounded. "What an odd place to put pins!" exclaimed Jessie, taking it. "It's handy," said Mr. Hoopdriver. "I saw a chap in a shop do it once." "You must have a careful disposition," she said, over her shoulder, kneeling down to the chair. "In the centre of Africa, up country that is, one learns to value pins," said Mr. Hoopdriver, after a perceptible pause. "There weren't over many pins in Africa. They don't lie about on the ground there." His face was now in a fine red glow. Where would the draper break out next? He thrust his hands into his coat pockets, then took one out again, furtively removed the second pin, and dropped it behind him gently. It fell with a loud ping on the fender. Happily, she made no remark, being preoccupied with the binding of the chair. Mr. Hoopdriver, instead of sitting down, went up to the table and stood against it, with his fingertips upon the cloth. They were keeping breakfast a tremendous time. He took up his rolled serviette, looked closely and scrutinizingly at the ring, then put his hand under the fold of the napkin and examined the texture, and put the thing down again. Then he had a vague impulse to finger his hollow wisdom tooth, happily checked. He suddenly discovered he was standing as if the table was a counter, and sat down forthwith. He drummed with his hand on the table. He felt dreadfully hot and self-conscious. "Breakfast is late," said Jessie, standing up. "Isn't it?" Conversation was slack. Jessie wanted to know the distance to Ringwood. Silence fell again. Mr. Hoopdriver, very uncomfortable and studying an easy bearing, looked again at the breakfast things and then idly lifted the corner of the tablecloth on the ends of his fingers and regarded it. 15-3, he thought privately. "Why do you do that?" said Jessie. "What?" said Hoopdriver, dropping the tablecloth convulsively. "Look at the cloth like that. I saw you do it yesterday too." Mr. Hoopdriver's face became quite a bright red. He began pulling his moustache nervously. "I know," he said, "I know. It's a queer habit, I know. But out there, you know, there's native servants, you know, and it's a queer thing to talk about, but one has to look at things to see, don't you know, whether they're quite clean or not. It's got to be a habit." "How odd," said Jessie. "Isn't it?" mumbled Hoopdriver. "If I were a Sherlock Holmes," said Jessie, "I suppose I could have told you were a colonial from little things like that. But anyhow, I guessed it, didn't I?" "Yes," said Hoopdriver in a melancholy tone. "You guessed it. Why not seize the opportunity for a neat confession and add, unhappily, in this case, you guessed wrong? Did she suspect? Then at the psychological moment, the girl bumped the door again with her tray and brought in the coffee and scrambled eggs. "I'm rather lucky with my intuitions, sometimes," said Jessie. Remorse, that had been accumulating in his mind for 2 days, surged to the top of his mind. What a shabby liar he was! And besides, he must sooner or later inevitably give himself away. Chapter 35. Mr. Hoopdriver helped the eggs and then, instead of beginning, sat with his cheek on his hand, watching Jessie pour out the coffee. His ears were a bright red, and his eyes bright. He took his coffee cup clumsily, cleared his throat, suddenly leant back in his chair and thrust his hands deep into his pockets. "I'll do it," he said aloud. "Do what?" said Jessie, looking up in surprise over the coffee pot. She was just beginning her scrambled egg. "Own up." "Own what?" "Miss Milton, I am a liar." He put his head on one side and regarded her with a frown of tremendous resolution. Then, in measured accents, and moving his head slowly from side to side, he announced, "I'm a draper." "You're a draper? I thought—" "You thought wrong, but it's bound to come up. Pins, attitude, habits, it's plain enough. I'm a draper's assistant let out for a 10 days holiday. Just a draper's assistant. Not much, is it? A counter-jumper. A draper's assistant isn't a position to be ashamed of, she said, recovering, and not quite understanding yet what all this meant. Yes, it is, he said, for a man in this country now, to be just another man's hand as I am, to have to wear what clothes you are told, and to go to church to please customers, and work. There's no other kind of men stand such hours. A drunken bricklayer's a king to it. But why are you telling me this now? It's important you should know at once. But Mr. Benson, that isn't all. If you don't mind my speaking about myself a bit, there's a few things I'd like to tell you. I can't go on deceiving you. My name's not Benson. Why I told you Benson, I don't know. Except that I am a kind of fool. Well, I wanted somehow to seem more than I was. My name's Hoopdriver. Yes? And that about South Africa and that lion? Well, lies. Lies? And the discovery of diamonds on the ostrich farm? Lies too. And all the reminiscences of the giraffes? Lies too. I never rode on no giraffes. I'd be afraid. He looked at her with a kind of sullen satisfaction. He had eased his conscience anyhow. She regarded him in infinite perplexity. This was a new side altogether to the man. But why? She began. Why did I tell you such things? I don't know. Silly sort of chap, I expect. I suppose I wanted to impress you. But somehow, now, I want you to know the truth. Silence. Breakfast untouched. I thought I'd tell you, said Mr. Hoopdriver. I suppose it's snobbishness and all that kind of thing as much as anything. I lay awake pretty near all last night, thinking about myself, thinking what a got-up imitation of a man I was, and all that. And you haven't any diamond shares, and you are not going into Parliament, and you're not— All lies, said Hoopdriver in a sepulchral voice. Lies from beginning to end. How I came to tell 'em, I don't know. She stared at him blankly. I never set eyes on Africa in my life, said Mr. Hoopdriver, completing the confession. Then he pulled his right hand from his pocket, and with the nonchalance of one to whom the bitterness of death is past, began to drink his coffee. It's a little surprising, began Jessie vaguely. Think it over, said Mr. Hoopdriver. I'm sorry from the bottom of my heart. And then breakfast proceeded in silence. Jessie ate very little and seemed lost in thought. Mr. Hoopdriver was so overcome by contrition and anxiety that he consumed an extraordinarily large breakfast, out of pure nervousness, and ate his scrambled eggs, for the most part with the spoon that belonged properly to the marmalade. His eyes were gloomily downcast. She glanced at him through her eyelashes. Once or twice she struggled with laughter. Once or twice she seemed to be indignant. I don't know what to think, she said at last. I don't know what to make of you, Brother Chris. I thought, do you know, that you were perfectly honest, and somehow, well, I think so still. Honest, with all those lies? I wonder. I don't, said Mr. Hoopdriver. I'm fair ashamed of myself. But anyhow, I've stopped deceiving you. I thought, said the young lady in grey, that the story of the lion— Lord, said Mr. Hoopdriver, don't remind me of that. I thought somehow, I felt, that the things you said didn't quite ring true. She suddenly broke out in laughter at the expression of his face. Of course you are honest, she said. How could I ever doubt it? As if I had never pretended. I see it all now. Abruptly she rose and extended her hand across the breakfast things. He looked at her doubtfully and saw the dancing friendliness in her eyes. He scarcely understood at first. He rose, holding the marmalade spoon, and took her proffered hand with abject humility. "Lord," he broke out, "if you aren't enough, but there! I see it all now." A brilliant inspiration had suddenly obscured her humour. She sat down suddenly, and he sat down too. "You did it," she said, "because you wanted to help me. And you thought I was too conventional to take help from one I might think my social inferior." "That was partly it," said Mr. Hoopdriver. "How you misunderstood me," she said. "You don't mind?" "It was noble of you, but I am sorry," she said. "You should think me likely to be ashamed of you because you follow a decent trade." "I didn't know at first, you see," said Mr. Hoopdriver, and he submitted meekly to a restoration of his self-respect. He was as useful a citizen as he could be. It was proposed and carried, and his lying was of the noblest. And so the breakfast concluded much more happily than his brightest expectation, and they rode out of ruddy little Blandford as though no shadow of any sort had come between them. Chapter 36. As they were sitting by the roadside among the pine trees halfway up a stretch of hill between Wimborne and Ringwood, however, Mr. Hoopdriver reopened the question of his worldly position. "Do you think," he began abruptly, removing a meditative cigarette from his mouth, "that a draper's shopman is a decent citizen?" "Why not?" "When he puts people off with what they don't quite want, for instance." "Need he do that?" "Salesmanship," said Hoopdriver. "Wouldn't get a crib if he didn't. It's no good your arguing. It's not a particularly honest nor a particularly useful trade. It's not very high up. There's no freedom and no leisure. 7 till 8:30 every day in the week. Don't leave much edge to live on, does it? Real workmen laugh at us, and educated chaps like bank clerks and solicitors' clerks look down on us. You look respectable outside, and inside you are packed in dormitories like convicts, fed on bread and butter and bullied like slaves. You're just superior enough to feel that you're not superior. Without capital, there's no prospects. One draper in 100 don't even earn enough to marry on. And if he does marry, his GV can just use him to black boots if he likes, and he daren't put his back up. That's drapery, and you tell me to be contented. Would you be contented if you was a shop girl?" She did not answer. She looked at him with distress in her brown eyes, and he remained gloomily in possession of the field. Presently he spoke. "I've been thinking," he said, and stopped. She turned her face, resting her cheek on the palm of her hand. There was a light in her eyes that made the expression of them tender. Mr. Hoopdriver had not looked in her face while he had talked. He had regarded the grass and pointed his remarks with red-knuckled hands held open and palms upwards. Now they hung limply over his knees. "Well," she said. "I was thinking it this morning," said Mr. Hoopdriver. "Yes?" "Of course, it's silly." "Well?" "It's like this. I'm 23 about. I had my schooling all right to 15, say. Well, that leaves me 8 years behind. Is it too late? I wasn't so backward. I did algebra and Latin up to auxiliary verbs and French genders. I got a kind of grounding." "And now, you mean, should you go on working?" "Yes," said Mr. Hoopdriver. "That's it. You can't do much at drapery without capital, you know. But if I could get really educated, I thought sometimes—" "Why not?" said the young lady in grey. Mr. Hoopdriver was surprised to see it in that light. "You think?" he said. "Of course. You are a man. You are free." She warmed. I wish I were you to have the chance of that struggle. Am I man enough? Said Mr. Hoopdriver aloud, but addressing himself. There's that 8 years, he said to her. You can make it up. What you call educated men, they're not going on. You can catch them. They're quite satisfied, playing golf and thinking of clever things to say to women like my stepmother and dining out. You're in front of them already in one thing. They think they know everything. You don't. And they know such little things. Lord, said Mr. Hoopdriver, how you encourage a fellow. If I could only help you, she said, and left an eloquent hiatus. He became pensive again. It's pretty evident you don't think much of a draper, he said abruptly. Another interval. Hundreds of men, she said, have come from the very lowest ranks of life. There was Burns, a ploughman, and Hugh Miller, a stonemason, and plenty of others. Dodsley was a footman. But drapers, we're too short of shabby genteel to rise. Our coats and cuffs might be crumpled. Wasn't there a clerk who wrote theology? He was a draper. There was one started a sewing cotton, the only one I ever heard tell of. Have you ever read Heart's Insurgent? Never, said Mr. Hoopdriver. He did not wait for her context, but suddenly broke out with an account of his literary requirements. The fact is, I've read precious little. One don't get much of a chance situated as I am. We have a library at business, and I've gone through that. Most Besant I've read, and a lot of Mrs. Braddon's and Rider Haggard, and Marie Corelli, and, well, a Ouida or so. They're good stories, of course, and first-class writers, but they didn't seem to have much to do with me. But there's heaps of books one hears talked about I haven't read. Don't you read any other books but novels? Scarcely ever. One gets tired after business, and you can't get the books. I have been to some extension lectures, of course, Elizabethan dramatists it was, but it seemed a little high-flown, you know. And I went and did wood carving at the same place, but it didn't seem leading nowhere, and I cut my thumb and chucked it. He made a depressing spectacle, with his face anxious and his hands limp. It makes me sick, he said, to think how I've been fooled with. My old schoolmaster ought to have a deuced hiding. He's a thief. He pretended to undertake to make a man of me, and he stole 23 years of my life, filled me up with scraps and sweepings. Here I am. I don't know anything, and I can't do anything, and all the learning time is over. Is it? She said, but he did not seem to hear her. My old people didn't know any better, and went and paid £30 premium. £30 premium, down to have me made this. The GV promised to teach me the trade, and he never taught me anything but to be a hand. It's the way they do with drapers' apprentices. If every swindler was locked up, well, you'd have nowhere to buy tape and cotton. It's all very well to bring up Burns and those chaps, but I'm not that make. Yet I'm not such muck that I might not have been better with teaching. I wonder what the chaps who sneer and laugh at such as me would be if they'd been fooled about as I've been. At 23, it's a long start. He looked up with a wintry smile, a sadder and wiser Hoopdriver indeed, than him of the glorious imaginings. It's you done this, he said. You're real, and it sets me thinking what I really am, and what I might have been. Suppose it was all different. Make it different. How? Work. Stop playing at life. Face it like a man. Ah, said Hoopdriver, glancing at her out of the corner of his eyes. And even then? No, it's not much good. I'm beginning too late. And there, in blankly thoughtful silence, that conversation ended. Chapter 37. In the New Forest. At Ringwood they lunched, and Jessie met with a disappointment. There was no letter for her at the post office. Opposite the hotel, the Checkered Career, was a machine shop with a conspicuously second-hand Marlborough Club tandem tricycle displayed in the window, together with the announcement that bicycles and tricycles were on hire within. The establishment was impressed upon Mr. Hoopdriver's mind by the proprietor's action in coming across the road and narrowly inspecting their machines. His action revived a number of disagreeable impressions, but happily came to nothing. While they were still lunching, a tall clergyman with a heated face entered the room and sat down at the table next to theirs. He was in a kind of holiday costume, that is to say, he had a more than usual high collar, fastened behind and rather the worse for the weather, and his long-tail coat had been replaced by a black jacket of quite remarkable brevity. He had faded brown shoes on his feet, his trouser legs were grey with dust, and he wore a hat of piebald straw in the place of a customary soft felt. He was evidently socially inclined. "A most charming day, sir," he said in a ringing tenor. "Charming," said Mr. Hoopdriver over a portion of pie. "You are, I perceive, cycling through this delightful country," said the clergyman. "Touring," explained Mr. Hoopdriver. "I can imagine that, with a properly oiled machine, there can be no easier nor pleasanter way of seeing the country." "No," said Mr. Hoopdriver, "it isn't half a bad way of getting about." "For a young and newly married couple, a tandem bicycle must be, I should imagine, a delightful bond." "Quite so," said Mr. Hoopdriver, reddening a little. "Do you ride a tandem?" "No, we're separate," said Mr. Hoopdriver. "The motion through the air is indisputably of a very exhilarating description." With that decision, the clergyman turned to give his orders to the attendant in a firm, authoritative voice for a cup of tea, 2 gelatine lozenges, bread and butter, salad, and a pie to follow. "The gelatine lozenges I must have. I require them to precipitate the tannin in my tea," he remarked to the room at large, and folding his hands, remained for some time with his chin thereon, staring fixedly at a little picture over Mr. Hoopdriver's head. "I myself am a cyclist," said the clergyman, descending suddenly upon Mr. Hoopdriver. "Indeed?" said Mr. Hoopdriver, attacking the moustache. "What machine, may I ask?" "I have recently become possessed of a tricycle. A bicycle is, I regret to say, considered too, how shall I put it, flippant by my parishioners, so I have a tricycle. I have just been hauling it hither." "Hauling?" said Jessie, surprised. "With a shoelace, and partly carrying it on my back." The pause was unexpected. Jessie had some trouble with a crumb. Mr. Hoopdriver's face passed through several phases of surprise. Then he saw the explanation. "Had an accident?" "I can hardly call it an accident. The wheels suddenly refused to go round. I found myself about 5 miles from here with an absolutely immobile machine." "Oh," said Mr. Hoopdriver, trying to seem intelligent, and Jessie glanced at this insane person. "It appears," said the clergyman, satisfied with the effect he had created, "that my man carefully washed out the bearings with paraffin and let the machine dry without oiling it again. The consequence was that they became heated to a considerable temperature and jammed. Even at the outset, the machine ran stiffly as well as noisily, and I, being inclined to ascribe this stiffness to my own lassitude, merely redoubled my exertions." "Hot work all round," said Mr. Hoopdriver. "You could scarcely put it more appropriately. It is my rule of life to do whatever I find to do with all my might. I believe, indeed, that the bearings became red-hot. Finally, one of the wheels jammed together. A side wheel it was, so that its stoppage necessitated an inversion of the entire apparatus, an inversion in which I participated." "Meaning that you went over?" said Mr. Hoopdriver, suddenly much amused. "Precisely, and not brooking my defeat, I suffered repeatedly. You may understand, perhaps, a natural impatience. I expostulated, playfully of course. Happily, the road was not overlooked. Finally, the entire apparatus became rigid and I abandoned the unequal contest. For all practical purposes, the tricycle was no better than a heavy chair without casters. It was a case of hauling or carrying. The clergyman's nutriment appeared in the doorway. 5 miles, said the clergyman. He began at once to eat bread and butter vigorously. Happily, he said, I am an eupeptic, energetic sort of person on principle. I would all men were likewise. It's the best way, agreed Mr. Hoopdriver, and the conversation gave credence to bread and butter. Gelatine, said the clergyman presently, stirring his tea thoughtfully, precipitates the tannin in one's tea and renders it easy of digestion. That's a useful sort of thing to know, said Mr. Hoopdriver. You are altogether welcome, said the clergyman, biting generously at 2 pieces of bread and butter, folded together. In the afternoon, our 2 wanderers rode on at an easy pace towards Stony Cross. Conversation languished, the topic of South Africa being in abeyance. Mr. Hoopdriver was silenced by disagreeable thoughts. He had changed the last sovereign at Ringwood. The fact had come upon him suddenly. Now too late, he was reflecting upon his resources. There was £20 or more in the Post Office Savings Bank in Putney, but his book was locked up in his box at the Antrobus establishment. Else this infatuated man would certainly have surreptitiously withdrawn the entire sum in order to prolong these journeyings even for a few days. As it was, the shadow of the end fell across his happiness. Strangely enough, in spite of his anxiety and the morning's collapse, he was still in a curious emotional state that was certainly not misery. He was forgetting his imaginings and posings, forgetting himself altogether, in his growing appreciation of his companion. The most tangible trouble in his mind was the necessity of breaking the matter to her. A long stretch uphill tired them long before Stony Cross was reached, and they dismounted and sat under the shade of a little oak tree. Near the crest, the road looped on itself so that, looking back, it sloped below them up to the right and then came towards them. About them grew a rich heather and stunted oaks on the edge of a deep ditch along the roadside, and this road was sandy. Below the steepness of the hill, however, it was grey and barred with shadows, for there the trees clustered thick and tall. Mr. Hoopdriver fumbled clumsily with his cigarettes. "There's a thing I got to tell you," he said, trying to be perfectly calm. "Yes," she said. "I'd like to just discuss your plans a bit, you know." "I'm very unsettled," said Jessie. "You are thinking of writing books? Or doing journalism, or teaching, or something like that? And keeping yourself independent of your stepmother?" "Yes." "How long did it take now to get anything of that sort to do?" "I don't know all that. I believe there are a great many women journalists and sanitary inspectors and black and white artists, but I suppose it takes time. Women, you know, edit most papers nowadays, George Egerton says. I ought, I suppose, to communicate with a literary agent." "Of course," said Hoopdriver. "It's very suitable work, not being heavy like the drapery. There's heavy brain labour, you must remember." "That wouldn't hurt you," said Mr. Hoopdriver, turning a compliment. "It's like this," he said, ending a pause. "It's a deuced nuisance alluding to these matters, but we got very little more money." He perceived that Jessie started, though he did not look at her. "I was counting, of course, on your friend's writing, and your being able to take some action today." Take some action was a phrase he had learnt at his last swap. Money, said Jessie. I didn't think of money. Hullo, here's a tandem bicycle, said Mr. Hoopdriver abruptly and pointing with his cigarette. She looked and saw two little figures emerging from among the trees at the foot of the slope. The riders were bowed sternly over their work and made a gallant but unsuccessful attempt to take the rise. The machine was evidently too highly geared for hill climbing, and presently the rearmost rider rose on his saddle and hopped off, leaving his companion to any fate he found proper. The foremost rider was a man, unused to such machines, and apparently undecided how to dismount. He wabbled a few yards up the hill with a long tail of machine wabbling behind him. Finally, he made an attempt to jump off as one does off a single bicycle, hit his boot against the backbone, and collapsed heavily, falling on his shoulder. She stood up. "Dear me," she said, "I hope he isn't hurt." The second rider went to the assistance of the fallen man. Hoopdriver stood up too. The lank, shaky machine was lifted up and wheeled out of the way, and then the fallen rider, being assisted, got up slowly and stood rubbing his arm. No serious injury seemed to be done to the man, and the couple presently turned their attention to the machine by the roadside. They were not in cycling clothes, Hoopdriver observed. One wore the grotesque raiment for which the Cockney discovery of the game of golf seems indirectly blamable. Even at this distance, the flopping flatness of his cap, the bright brown leather at the top of his calves, and the checkering of his stockings were perceptible. The other rear rider was a slender little man in grey. "Amateurs," said Mr. Hoopdriver. Jessie stood staring, and a veil of thought dropped over her eyes. She no longer regarded the two men who were now tinkering at the machine down below there. "How much have you?" she said. He thrust his right hand into his pocket and produced 6 coins, counted them with his left index finger, and held them out to her. 13.4 said Mr. Hoopdriver. "Every penny." "I have half a sovereign," she said. "Our bill wherever we stop." The hiatus was more eloquent than many words. "I never thought of money coming in to stop us like this," said Jessie. "It's a juiced nuisance." "Money," said Jessie. "Is it possible, surely, conventionally, may only people of means live their own lives? I never thought." Pause. "Here's some more cyclists coming," said Mr. Hoopdriver. The two men were both busy with their bicycles still, but now from among the trees emerged the massive bulk of a Marlborough Club tandem, ridden by a slender woman in grey and a burly man in a Norfolk jacket. Following close upon this came a lank black figure in a piebald straw hat, riding a tricycle of antiquated pattern with 2 large wheels in front. The man in grey remained bowed over the bicycle, with his stomach resting on the saddle, but his companion stood up and addressed some remark to the tricycle rider. Then it seemed as if he pointed uphill to where Mr. Hoopdriver and his companion stood side by side. A still odder thing followed. The lady in grey took out her handkerchief, appeared to wave it for a moment, and then, at a hasty motion from her companion, the white signal vanished. "Surely," said Jessie, peering under her hand, "it's never." The tandem tricycle began to ascend the hill, quartering elaborately from side to side to ease the ascent. It was evident, from his heaving shoulders and depressed head, that the burly gentleman was exerting himself. The clerical person on the tricycle assumed the shape of a note of interrogation. Then, on the heels of this procession, came a dog-cart driven by a man in a billycock hat and containing a lady in dark green. "Looks like some sort of excursion," said Hoopdriver. Jessie did not answer. She was still peering under her hand. "Surely," she said. The clergyman's efforts were becoming convulsive. With a curious jerking motion, the tricycle he rode twisted round upon itself, and he partly dismounted and partly fell off. He turned his machine uphill again immediately and began to wheel it. Then the burly gentleman dismounted and, with a courtly attentiveness, assisted the lady in grey to alight. There was some little difference of opinion as to assistance. She so clearly wished to help push. Finally she gave in, and the burly gentleman began impelling the machine uphill by his own unaided strength. His face made a dot of brilliant colour among the greys and greens at the foot of the hill. The tandem bicycle was now, it seems, repaired, and this joined the tail of the procession, its riders walking behind the dog-cart from which the lady in green and the driver had now descended. "Mr. Hoopdriver," said Jessie, "those people, I'm almost sure—" "Lord," said Mr. Hoopdriver, reading the rest in her face, and he turned to pick up his machine at once. Then he dropped it and assisted her to mount. At the sight of Jessie mounting against the skyline, the people coming up the hill suddenly became excited and ended Jessie's doubts at once. 2 handkerchiefs waved, and someone shouted. The riders of the tandem bicycle began to run it uphill past the other vehicles. But our young people did not wait for further developments of the pursuit. In another moment they were out of sight, riding hard down a steady incline towards Stony Cross. Before they had dropped among the trees out of sight of the hill brow, Jessie looked back and saw the tandem rising over the crest, with its rear rider just tumbling into the saddle. "They're coming," she said, and bent her head over her handles in true professional style. They whirled down into the valley, over a white bridge, and saw ahead of them a number of shaggy little ponies frisking in the roadway. Involuntarily they slackened. "Shoo!" said Mr. Hoopdriver, and the ponies kicked up their heels derisively. At that, Mr. Hoopdriver lost his temper and charged at them, narrowly missed one, and sent them jumping the ditch into the bracken under the trees, leaving the way clear for Jessie. Then the road rose quietly but persistently. The treadles grew heavy, and Mr. Hoopdriver's breath sounded like a saw. The tandem appeared, making frightful exertions at the foot, while the chase was still climbing. Then, thank heaven, a crest and a stretch of up-and-down road, whose only disadvantage was its pitiless exposure to the afternoon sun. The tandem apparently dismounted at the hill, and did not appear against the hot blue sky until they were already near some trees and a good mile away. "We're gaining," said Mr. Hoopdriver, with a little Niagara of perspiration dropping from brow to cheek. "That hill—" But that was their only gleam of success. They were both nearly spent. Hoopdriver indeed was quite spent, and only a feeling of shame prolonged the liquidation of his bankrupt physique. From that point the tandem gained upon them steadily. At the Rufus Stone it was scarcely 100 yards behind. Then one desperate spurt, and they found themselves upon a steady downhill stretch among thick pine woods. Downhill, nothing can beat a highly geared tandem bicycle. Automatically, Mr. Hoopdriver put up his feet, and Jessie slackened her pace. Hoopdriver felt a mad impulse to collide with this abominable machine as it passed him. His only consolation was to notice that its riders, riding violently, were quite as dishevelled as himself and smothered in sandy white dust. Abruptly, Jessie stopped and dismounted, and the tandem riders shot panting past them downhill. "Brake!" said Dangle, who was riding behind, and stood up on the pedals. For a moment the velocity of the thing increased, and then they saw the dust fly from the brake as it came down on the front tyre. Dangle's right leg floundered in the air as he came off in the road. The tandem wobbled. "Hold it!" cried Phipps over his shoulder, going on downhill. "I can't get off if you don't hold it." He put on the brake until the machine stopped almost dead, and then, feeling unstable, began to pedal again. Dangle shouted after him. "Put out your foot, man," said Dangle. In this way the tandem riders were carried a good 100 yards or more beyond their quarry. Then Phipps realised his possibilities, slacked up with the brake, and let the thing go over sideways, dropping onto his right foot. With his left leg still over the saddle, and still holding the handles, he looked over his shoulder and began addressing uncomplimentary remarks to Dangle. "You only think of yourself," said Phipps, with a florid face. "They have forgotten us," said Jessie, turning her machine. "There was a road at the top of the hill to Lyndhurst," said Hoopdriver, following her example. "It's no good. There's no money. We must give it up. But let us go back to that hotel at Rufusstone. I don't see why we should be led captive." So, to the consternation of the tandem riders, Jessie and her companion mounted and rode quietly back up the hill again. As they dismounted at the hotel entrance, the tandem overtook them, and immediately afterwards the dog-cart came into view in pursuit. Dangle jumped off. "Miss Milton, I believe," said Dangle, panting and raising a damp cap from his wet and matted hair. "I say," said Phipps, receding involuntarily. "Don't go doing it again, Dangle. Help a chap." "1 minute," said Dangle, and ran after his colleague. Jessie leant her machine against the wall and went into the hotel entrance. Hoopdriver remained in the hotel entrance, limp but defiant. Chapter 38. At the Rufusstone. He folded his arms as Dangle and Phipps returned towards him. Phipps was abashed by his inability to cope with the tandem, which he was now wheeling, but Dangle was inclined to be quarrelsome. "Miss Milton," he said briefly. Mr. Hoopdriver bowed over his folded arms. "Miss Milton within," said Dangle. "And not to be disturbed," said Mr. Hoopdriver. "You are a scoundrel, sir," said Mr. Dangle. "At your service," said Mr. Hoopdriver. "She awaits her stepmother, sir." Mr. Dangle hesitated. "She will be here immediately," he said. "Here is her friend, Miss Murgle." Mr. Hoopdriver unfolded his arms slowly, and, with an air of immense calm, thrust his hands into his breeches pockets. Then, with one of those fatal hesitations of his, it occurred to him that this attitude was merely vulgarly defiant. He withdrew both, returned one, and pulled at the insufficient moustache with the other. Miss Murgle caught him in confusion. "Is this the man?" she said to Dangle, and forthwith, "How dare you, sir? How dare you face me, that poor girl?" "You will permit me to observe," began Mr. Hoopdriver, with a splendid drawl, seeing himself for the first time in all this business as a romantic villain. "Ugh!" said Miss Murgle, unexpectedly striking him about the midriff with her extended palms, and sending him staggering backward into the hall of the hotel. "Let me pass," said Miss Murgle, in towering indignation. "How dare you resist my passage?" and so swept by him and into the dining-room wherein Jessie had sought refuge. As Mr. Hoopdriver struggled for equilibrium with the umbrella-stand, Dangle and Phipps, roused from their inertia by Miss Murgle's activity, came in upon her heels, Phipps leading. "How dare you prevent that lady passing?" said Phipps. Mr. Hoopdriver looked obstinate and, to Dangle's sense, dangerous, but he made no answer. A waiter in full bloom appeared at the end of the passage, guardant. "It is men of your stamp, sir," said Phipps, "who discredit manhood." Mr. Hoopdriver thrust his hands into his pockets. "Who the deuce are you?" shouted Mr. Hoopdriver fiercely. "Who are you, sir?" retorted Phipps. "Who are you? That's the question. What are you, and what are you doing wandering at large with a young lady under age?" "Don't speak to him," said Dangle. "I'm not a-going to tell all my secrets to anyone who comes at me," said Hoopdriver. "Not likely," and added fiercely, "and that I tell you, sir." He and Phipps stood, legs apart, and both looking exceedingly fierce at one another. And heaven alone knows what might not have happened if the long clergyman had not appeared in the doorway, heated but deliberate. "Petticoated anachronism," said the long clergyman in the doorway, apparently still suffering from the antiquated prejudice that demanded a third wheel and a black coat from a clerical rider. He looked at Phipps and Hoopdriver for a moment, then extending his hand towards the latter, he waved it up and down 3 times, saying, "Chuck, chuck, chuck," very deliberately as he did so. Then, with a concluding, "Ugh," and a gesture of repugnance, he passed on into the dining room, from which the voice of Miss Murgle was distinctly audible, remarking that the weather was extremely hot, even for the time of year. This expression of extreme disapprobation had a very demoralizing effect upon Hoopdriver, a demoralization that was immediately completed by the advent of the massive Widgery. "Is this the man?" said Widgery very grimly, and producing a special voice for the occasion from somewhere deep in his neck. "Don't hurt him," said Mrs. Milton, with clasped hands. "However much wrong he has done her, no violence." "How many more of you?" said Hoopdriver, at bay before the umbrella stand. "Where is she? What has he done with her?" said Mrs. Milton. "I'm not going to stand here and be insulted by a lot of strangers," said Mr. Hoopdriver, "so you needn't think it." "Please don't worry, Mr. Hoopdriver," said Jessie, suddenly appearing in the door of the dining room. "I'm here, Mother." Her face was white. Mrs. Milton said something about her child and made an emotional charge at Jessie. The embrace vanished into the dining room. Widgery moved as if to follow and hesitated. "You better make yourself scarce," he said to Mr. Hoopdriver. "I shan't do anything of the kind," said Mr. Hoopdriver, with a catching of the breath. "I'm here defending that young lady." "You've done her enough mischief, I should think," said Widgery, suddenly walking towards the dining room and closing the door behind him, leaving Dangle and Phipps with Hoopdriver. "Clear?" said Phipps, threateningly. "I shall go and sit out in the garden," said Mr. Hoopdriver, with dignity. "There I shall remain." "Don't make a row with him," said Dangle. And Mr. Hoopdriver retired, unassaulted, in almost sobbing dignity. Chapter 39. So here is the world with us again, and our sentimental excursion is over. In the front of the Rufus Stone Hotel, conceive a remarkable collection of wheeled instruments, watched over by Dangle and Phipps in grave stately attitudes, and by the driver of a stylish dog-cart from Ringwood. In the garden behind, in an attitude of nervous prostration, Mr. Hoopdriver was seated on a rustic seat. Through the open window of a private sitting-room came a murmur of voices, as of men and women in conference. Occasionally, something that might have been a girlish sob. "I fail to see what status Widgery has," said Dangle, thrusting himself in there. "He takes too much upon himself," said Phipps. "I've been noticing little things, yesterday and today," said Dangle, and stopped. They went to the cathedral together in the afternoon. "Financially, it would be a good thing for her, of course," said Dangle, with a gloomy magnanimity. He felt drawn to Phipps now by the common trouble, in spite of the man's checkered legs. Financially, it wouldn't be half bad. "He's so dull and heavy," said Phipps. Meanwhile, within, the clergyman had, by promptitude and dexterity, taken the chair and was opening the case against the unfortunate Jessie. I regret to have to say that my heroine had been appalled by the visible array of public opinion against her excursion, to the pitch of tears. She was sitting with flushed cheeks and swimming eyes at the end of the table opposite to the clergyman. She held her handkerchief crumpled up in her extended hand. Mrs. Milton sat as near to her as possible, and occasionally made little dabs with her hand at Jessie's hand to indicate forgiveness. These advances were not reciprocated, which touched Widgery very much. The lady in green, Miss Murgle, B.A., sat on the opposite side near the clergyman. She was the strong-minded schoolmistress to whom Jessie had written and who had immediately precipitated the pursuit upon her. She had picked up the clergyman in Ringwood and had told him everything forthwith, having met him once at a British Association meeting. He had immediately constituted himself administrator of the entire business. Widgery, having been foiled in an attempt to conduct the proceedings, stood with his legs wide apart in front of the fireplace ornament and looked profound and sympathetic. Jessie's account of her adventures was a chary one and given amidst frequent interruptions. She surprised herself by skilfully omitting any allusion to the Bechamel episode. She completely exonerated Hoopdriver from the charge of being more than an accessory to her escape. But public feeling was heavy against Hoopdriver. Her narrative was inaccurate and sketchy, but happily the others were too anxious to pass opinions to pin her down to particulars. At last, they had all the facts they would permit. "My dear young lady," said the clergyman, "I can only ascribe this extravagant and regrettable expedition of yours to the wildest misconceptions of your place in the world and of your duties and responsibilities. Even now, it seems to me your present emotion is due not so much to a real and sincere penitence for your disobedience and folly as to a positive annoyance at your most fortunate interference." "Not that," said Mrs. Milton in a low tone. "Not that."
"But why did she go off like this?" said Widgery. "That's what I want to know."
Jessie made an attempt to speak, but Mrs. Milton said, "Hush," and the ringing tenor of the clergyman rode triumphantly over the meeting.
"I cannot understand this spirit of unrest that has seized upon the more intelligent portion of the feminine community. You had a pleasant home, a most refined and intelligent lady in the position of your mother to cherish and protect you."
"If I had a mother," gulped Jessie, succumbing to the obvious snare of self-pity and sobbing.
"To cherish, protect, and advise you. And you must needs go out of it all alone into a strange world of unknown dangers."
"I wanted to learn," said Jessie.
"You wanted to learn. May you never have anything to unlearn."
"Oh," said Mrs. Milton, very sadly. "It isn't fair for all of you to argue at me at once," submitted Jessie irrelevantly.
"A world full of unknown dangers," resumed the clergyman. "Your proper place was surely the natural surroundings that are part of you. You have been unduly influenced, it is only too apparent, by a class of literature which, with all due respect to a distinguished authoress that shall be nameless, I must call the New Woman literature. In that deleterious ingredient of our book boxes—"
"I don't altogether agree with you there," said Miss Murgle, throwing her head back and regarding him firmly through her spectacles, and Mr. Widgery coughed. "What has all this to do with me?" asked Jessie, availing herself of the interruption. "The point is," said Mrs. Milton in her defence, "that in my books, all I want to do," said Jessie, "is to go about freely by myself. Girls do so in America. Why not here?" "Social conditions are entirely different in America," said Miss Murgle. "Here we respect class distinctions."
"With a strange young man, socially your inferior," said Widgery, and made her flush by his tone.
"Why not?" she said. "With anybody." "They don't do that even in America," said Miss Murgle.
"My dear young lady," said the clergyman, "the most elementary principles of decorum. A day will come when you will better understand how entirely subservient your ideas are to the very fundamentals of our present civilization. when you will better understand the harrowing anxiety you have given Mrs. Milton by this inexplicable flight of yours. We can only put things down at present, in charity to your ignorance." "You have to consider the general body of opinion, too," said Widgery.
"Precisely," said Miss Murgle. "There is no such thing as conduct in the absolute."
"If once this most unfortunate business gets about," said the clergyman, "it will do you infinite harm."
"But I've done nothing wrong. Why should I be responsible for other people's—" "The world has no charity," said Mrs. Milton. "For a girl," said Jessie, "no."
"Now do let us stop arguing, my dear young lady, and let us listen to reason. Never mind how or why this conduct of yours will do you infinite harm, if once it is generally known. And not only that, it will cause infinite pain to those who care for you. But if you will return at once to your home, causing it to be understood that you have been with friends for these last few days—"
"Tell lies," said Jessie. "Certainly not, most certainly not. But I understand that is how your absence is understood at present, and there is no reason—" Jessie's grip tightened on her handkerchief. "I won't go back," she said, "to have it as I did before. I want a room of my own, what books I need to read, to be free to go out by myself alone, teaching." "Anything," said Mrs. Milton, "anything in reason." "But will you keep your promise?" said Jessie.
"Surely you won't dictate to your mother," said Widgery.
"My stepmother. I don't want to dictate. I want definite promises now."
"This is most unreasonable," said the clergyman.
"Very well," said Jessie, swallowing a sob, but with unusual resolution. "Then I won't go back. My life is being frittered away."
"Let her have her way," said Widgery.
"A room, then, all your men. I'm not to come down and talk away half my days." "My dear child, if only to save you," said Mrs. Milton. "If you don't keep your promise—"
"Then I take it the matter is practically concluded," said the clergyman, "and that you very properly submit to return to your proper home. And now, if I may offer a suggestion, it is that we take tea. Freed of its tannin, nothing I think is more refreshing and stimulating." "There's a train from Lyndhurst at 13 minutes to 6, said Widgery, unfolding a timetable. "That gives us about half an hour, or 3/4 here, if a conveyance is obtainable, that is." "A gelatine lozenge dropped into the teacup precipitates the tannin in the form of tannate of gelatine," said the clergyman to Miss Murgle, in a confidential bray. Jessie stood up and saw through the window a depressed head and shoulders over the top of the back of the garden seat. She moved towards the door. "While you have tea, Mother," she said, "I must tell Mr. Hoopdriver of our arrangements." "Don't you think I—" began the clergyman. "No," said Jessie very rudely. "I don't. But, Jessie, haven't you already—" "You are already breaking the capitulation," said Jessie. "Will you want the whole half-hour?" said Widgery at the bell.
"Every minute," said Jessie in the doorway. "He's behaved very nobly to me."
"There's tea," said Widgery.
"I've had tea."
"He may not have behaved badly," said the clergyman, "but he's certainly an astonishingly weak person to let a wrong-headed young girl—" Jessie closed the door into the garden. Meanwhile, Mr. Hoopdriver made a sad figure in the sunlight outside. It was over, this wonderful excursion of his, so far as she was concerned, and with the swift blow that separated them, he realized all that those days had done for him. He tried to grasp the bearings of their position. Of course, they would take her away to those social attitudes of hers. She would become an inaccessible young lady again. Would they let him say goodbye to her? How extraordinary it had all been. He recalled the moment when he had first seen her riding, with the sunlight behind her, along the riverside road. He recalled that wonderful night at Bognor, remembering it as if everything had been done of its own initiative. Brave, brave, she had called him, and afterwards, when she came down to him in the morning, kindly, quiet. He remembered some intention of the sort. Now these people snatched her away from him as though he was scarcely fit to live in the same world with her. No more he was. He felt he had presumed upon her worldly ignorance in travelling with her day after day. She was so dainty, so delightful, so serene. He began to recapitulate her expressions, the light of her eyes, the turn of her face. He wasn't good enough to walk in the same road with her. Nobody was. Suppose they let him say goodbye to her. What could he say? That? But they were sure not to let her talk to him alone. Her mother would be there as, what was it? Chaperone. He'd never once had the chance of saying what he felt. Indeed, it was only now he was beginning to realize what he felt. Love, he wouldn't presume. It was worship. If only he could have one more chance. He must have one more chance, somewhere, somehow. Then he would pour out his soul to her eloquently. He felt eloquently, and the words would come. He was dust under her feet. His meditation was interrupted by the click of a door handle, and Jessie appeared in the sunlight under the veranda. "Come away from here," she said to Hoopdriver, as he rose to meet her. "I'm going home with them. We have to say goodbye." Mr. Hoopdriver winced, opened and shut his mouth, and rose without a word. Chapter 40. At first, Jessie Milton and Mr. Hoopdriver walked away from the hotel in silence. He heard a catching in her breath, and glanced at her and saw her lips pressed tight and a tear on her cheek. Her face was hot and bright. She was looking straight before her. He could think of nothing to say, and thrust his hands in his pockets and looked away from her intentionally. After a while, she began to talk. They dealt disjointedly with scenery first, and then with the means of self-education. She took his address at Antrobus's and promised to send him some books. But even with that, it was spiritless, aching talk, Hoopdriver felt, for the fighting mood was over. She seemed to him preoccupied with the memories of her late battle, and that appearance hurt him. "It's the end," he whispered to himself. "It's the end." They went into a hollow and up a gentle wooded slope, and came at last to a high and open space overlooking a wide expanse of country. There, by a common impulse, they stopped. She looked at her watch, a little ostentatiously. They stared at the billows of forest rolling away beneath them, crest beyond crest of leafy trees, fading at last into blue. The end ran through his mind to the exclusion of all speakable thoughts. "And so," she said presently, breaking the silence, "it comes to goodbye." For half a minute he did not answer. Then he gathered his resolution. "There is one thing I must say." "Well," she said, surprised, and abruptly forgetting the recent argument. "I ask no return, but—" Then he stopped. "I won't say it. It's no good. It would be rot from me now. I wasn't going to say anything. Goodbye." She looked at him with a startled expression in her eyes. "No," she said. "But don't forget you are going to work. Remember, Brother Chris, you are my friend. You will work. You are not a very strong man, you know. Now, you will forgive me, nor do you know all you should. But what will you be in 6 years' time?" He stared hard in front of him still, and the lines about his weak mouth seemed to strengthen. He knew she understood what he could not say. "I'll work," he said concisely. They stood side by side for a moment. Then he said, with a motion of his head, "I won't come back to them. Do you mind going back alone?" She took 10 seconds to think. "No," she said, and held out her hand, biting her nether lip.
Goodbye, she whispered. He turned with a white face, looked into her eyes, took her hand limply, and then with a sudden impulse lifted it to his lips. She would have snatched it away, but his grip tightened to her movement. She felt the touch of his lips, and then he dropped her fingers and turned from her and was striding down the slope. A dozen paces away his foot turned in the lip of a rabbit hole, and he stumbled forward and almost fell. He recovered his balance and went on, not looking back. He never once looked back. She stared at his receding figure until it was small and far below her, and then, the tears running over her eyelids now, turned slowly and walked with her hands gripped hard together behind her, towards Stony Cross again. I did not know, she whispered to herself. I did not understand, even now. No, I do not understand. Chapter 41. The Envoy. So the story ends, dear reader. Mr. Hoopdriver, sprawling down there among the bracken, must sprawl without our prying, I think, or listening to what chances to his breathing. And of what came of it all, of the 6 years and afterwards, this is no place to tell. In truth, there is no telling it, for the years have still to run. But if you see how a mere counter-jumper, a cad on casters, and a fool to boot, may come to feel the little insufficiencies of life, and if he has to any extent won your sympathies, my end is attained. If it is not attained, may heaven forgive us both. Nor will we follow this adventurous young lady of ours back to her home at Surbiton, to her new struggle against Widgery and Mrs. Milton combined. For, as she will presently hear, that devoted man has got his reward. For her, also, your sympathies are invited. The rest of this great holiday, too, 5 days there are left of it, is beyond the limits of our design. You see fitfully a slender figure in a dusty brown suit and heather mixture stockings and brown shoes, not intended to be cycled in, flitting Londonward through Hampshire and Berkshire and Surrey, going economically, for excellent reasons. Day by day he goes on, riding fitfully and for the most part through by-roads, but getting a few miles to the northeastward every day. He is a narrow-chested person with a nose hot and tanned at the bridge with unwanted exposure and brown red-knuckled fists. A musing expression sits upon the face of this rider, you observe. Sometimes he whistles noisily to himself, sometimes he speaks aloud. A deuced good try anyhow, you hear, and sometimes, and that too often for my liking, he looks irritable and hopeless. I know, he says, I know it's over and done. It isn't in me. You ain't man enough, Hoopdriver. Look at your silly hands. Oh, my God. And a gust of passion comes upon him, and he rides furiously for a space. Sometimes again his face softens. Anyhow, if I'm not to see her, she's going to lend me books, he thinks, and gets such comfort as he can. Then again, books? What's books? Once or twice triumphant memories of the earlier incidents nerve his face for a while. I put the kibosh on his little game, he remarks. I did that. And one might even call him happy in these phases. And, by the by, the machine you notice has been enamel-painted grey and carries a sonorous gong. This figure passes through Basingstoke and Bagshot, Staines, Hampton and Richmond, at last in Putney High Street, glowing with the warmth of an August sunset, and with all the prentice boys busy shutting up shop, and the work girls going home, and the shop folks peeping abroad, and the white buses full of late clerks and city folk rumbling home to their dinners, we part from him. He is back. Tomorrow the early rising, the dusting and drudgery begin again, but with a difference.
with wonderful memories and still more wonderful desires and ambitions, replacing those discrepant dreams. He turns out of the high street at the corner, dismounts with a sigh, and pushes his machine through the gates of the Antrobus stable yard as the apprentice with the high collar holds them open. There are words of greeting. South Coast, you hear, and splendid weather, splendid. He sighs. Yes, swapped him off for a couple of sovs. It's a deuced good machine. The gate closes upon him with a slam, and he vanishes from our ken. The end.